Hey everyone, happy Saturday. This is our Kripke Naming and Necessity Hangout on Lecture 1. I have Alex and Helena, Hypatia, and Joe joining me. Maybe we'll get some more in as we get going. I was going to, before we kind of get rolling into the lecture, I was going to do a quick 2-slide introduction to Kripke. So let me get my screen share going here. Okay. So Saul Kripke. Let's see. Okay. So he's a not dead American philosopher, which is good. This is our first not dead American philosopher. He was a student of Quine at Harvard. It sounded like he got into teaching almost immediately after his bachelor's, and eventually was a professor at Princeton, I believe. Naming and Necessity represents 3 lectures he gave in January of 1970, and it was published as a collection in 1980. Lecture 1 generally deals with proper names and descriptions. Lecture 2 gets into his cluster theory of names and a causal the start of a causal theory of reference. And lecture 3 deals with natural kinds and the mind-body problem. And I was encouraged to find he has a great voice. Actually, he's got a very bizarre voice. He's a very eccentric guy, and his voice kind of goes along with that. I actually was wondering if they were having audio issues when I was listening to the lecture. So necessity and a priori is what we're going to be kind of focusing on, which is the heart of lecture 1. In part, this is a refutation to kind of the Frege, Russell definite descriptions and the descriptivists that came after, I think Wittgenstein and Searle and some others. Hopefully my wife gets that. Descriptivist theories generally entail sense of a designator to be a sense of a designator to be its meaning, or that that descriptions are synonymous with names, and Kripke is going to counter this. And in this first lecture, the Kantian notion that anything that's necessarily true is that it implies that it's a priori truth as well. And he wants to decouple, he will argue to decouple those 2 concepts. And that's my last slide. Sorry, I was a bit jumbled there.
Can I just add something on a biographical note with respect to Kripke? So, this word tends to get bandied about quite a bit, but I think it might be fair, just out of interest to anybody who's watching, that Kripke may, in fact, be an actual prodigy. Alex can correct me if I'm wrong, but he basically invented relational semantics, when he was 15, 16 or so?
Something like that, yeah.
Like, he basically revolutionized modal logic. Well, most of us were still worried about girls and focusing on trying to pass algebra. So, yeah. So it may be fair to consider Kripke to be an actual genius, given that he practically revolutionized modal logic while he was still in high school.
Yeah, a lot of that. I've described him before as like the Michael Jackson of modal logic or something, and like he did all his greatest work when he was really young. However, the content of naming and necessity is also enough to make you a great philosopher. I think even if he hadn't done all of that stuff then, we would still be talking about this now. So unlike Michael Jackson, in my view, he continued to do good stuff even when he was older.
Yeah, he didn't. It sounds like he doesn't. He just lectures now. He hasn't been published in a long time.
Well, actually, there was a book came out not so long ago. It's kind of a collection of some essays that have already been published and a few new ones called something. I have it upstairs. So, like this, it's not a book. That he didn't write a book. He just published a load of papers.
Are you talking about the John Locke lectures, or is that a different book? One that came out more recently?
No, are these not John Locke lectures that he's giving here? Let me see.
It was like reference and something, or whatever, I think was the title. Or I don't know if you're referring to a more recent book.
I'm referring to a fairly recent book. Anyway, there's a very few books, essentially. He's one of those philosophers that doesn't publish many books, doesn't really do very much. He's such a high-value ticket after his work as a teenager that he just walked into his job at Princeton. They have these jobs open all the time where they're just hoping to scoop up somebody like Kripke, where it's not a position that needs to be filled by the end of the semester or something with particular teaching responsibilities or anything. They just, if someone's amazing, if someone's totally brilliant, they'll just bring him in. Good places like that, Oxford, Princeton, Harvard, whatever. And Kripke's one of those guys. He was just so great that, yeah, maybe he just did his bachelor's and then got a full-time teaching position. That wouldn't surprise me. I don't know that.
Yeah, he did his bachelor's, and then there's another university that he taught at before going to Princeton. But he was hired straight out of his bachelor's. And most, not surprisingly, most of the stuff that I dug up on him would start off by saying that he's arguably the greatest American philosopher. So
yeah, he's definitely widely cited. So there was a sorry. Have we got a delay?
No, I was just going to say maybe just a hair, yeah. or maybe I'm just a rude bastard. The interesting thing, this is completely random, but I couldn't find a lot of lectures by him, which was really interesting to me. I couldn't find a lot of recordings of him, despite that being said of him that he's only been, other than a little bit of writing, he hasn't been publishing nearly as much as he did maybe early on, or that he went on lecturing for a long time, but I had a hard time actually finding things. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Philosophical Troubles is the collected papers work that I was thinking of, and of course there's Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language, which was another. That may actually be a book-length publication that he actually genuinely wrote.
Right, he wrote that recently, right?
The Philosophical Troubles is a collection of papers, some of which were published recently. Yes, the Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language is 1982.
Okay, do you want to maybe, Alex, would you mind setting up the kind of the context of where I'd mentioned about Russell and Frege, and we've kind of been on this rule of we started with Russell and Frege in the Sense and Reference, I almost said Sense and Sensibility hangout, and then we got into talking about Quine and two dogmas. And being a student of Quine, it's funny when you read Kripke, you can see some of that influence there, although it sounds like Kripke was often running at a young age anyway. But do you want to maybe set what he's responding to? Do we want to maybe set the table, as it were, as we get into the text?
Yeah. Okay. So there's various sorts of orthodoxies that are being challenged to some extent in this first lecture, which is what makes it so interesting. So first of all, I suppose, going on from our first hangout, or your first hangout, the one that I was in previously, where there was the kind of Russell Frege view on how reference works, and in particular there was this descriptivist theory, which says something along the lines of that the meaning of a name, say, could be thought of as being a kind of complex propositional function that picks out an individual by using quantifiers and predicates in such a way as to make it so that only one thing is picked out. So, for instance, if we could say that the name Alex could be thought of as saying something like, there is at least one thing such that it's this bearded philosophy guy talking. There's at most one thing such that it's this bearded philosophy guy talking. And then by saying, by kind of coordinating those two quantifiers in that manner, you end up sort of picking me out individually without using a name as a kind of device that simply points directly to me. So it's a kind of more complicated piece of semantic machinery, and we saw that it had some advantages in the sense that it helped us out when we had problems with negative existentials, when we're talking about things like the present king of France, which doesn't exist, or if you say my sister, so I don't have a sister, so what's the semantic value of phrases like that? Now, Kripke wants to challenge the idea that names work like that, and he proposes a different way to think about names. At least there's some subtlety to it, I suppose, which we'll get into, but he's quite okay with the idea that we could use descriptions to fix reference. But what he's not okay with is that we would have descriptions as the meaning, the semantic meaning of these terms. So it's perfectly okay to use a description. If someone says to you, do you know George? You go, who's that? And you go, oh, it's that guy over there with the martini glass in his hands or something. That's okay, right? You are picking out the reference for the person. It enables you to find out who you're talking about. But what we're not supposed to do is understand that the meaning of the term George, whatever, is the guy standing over there with the martini glass. And Kripke's got some, given his proposal of how to understand how names work, he suggests that the modal properties of descriptions basically gives rise to a whole load of problems, and that his view, his rigid designator view of names instead avoids those problems. So we've got a kind of a critique of the descriptivist account of meaning for names, which uses modal worries as a way of undermining that theory. And then secondly, we've also got, I suppose the thing that most people remember him for in this is the account. So we've got these three related but subtly distinct ideas that form kind of central core of philosophical concepts. It kind of goes back to Kant, but it's not invented by Kant. It's just kind of orthodoxy that we inherit from this, which is something like you've got these concepts of a priori, analytic, and necessary. So you could say that a proposition is a priori, you could say that a proposition is analytic, you could say that a proposition is necessary. Now, maybe they mean different things. We can cash out that they mean different things, but the orthodoxy that Kripke is willing to challenge here is the idea that in some sense they entail one another. So that if a proposition is necessary, then it's a priori. If it's analytic, then it's necessary, these types of things, right? So it's in some sense, we may have had this assumption before that they mean different things, but we think that they somehow come as a package. So if proposition is one of them, it's all of them. That's the kind of general idea. And Kripke wants to say, specifically to challenge it by, and I suppose the most interesting examples are that you could have something that's known a priori, but is nevertheless contingent. And it will spell that out with reference to this new theory of reference that he has, the idea of the rigid designators. That enables us to give examples of things which are, like I said, a priori and contingent. And I suppose then the other combination that was unusual is a posteriori and necessary. So we can give examples for both of those two types of things, which previously the orthodoxy, I suppose, he's challenging here is that those two always come in pairs, contingent, a posteriori, necessary, and a priori. Okay, so hopefully that's set up basically what we're going to be covering in this lecture, I think.
Yeah.
More or less. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering if maybe we wanted to talk about, you mentioned modality, and I'm not sure that a lot of people watching, some may not. Could you maybe flesh out when you were talking about that he sees complexities there or issues when you get into names in terms of modal quantifiers or qualities?
Yeah, okay, good. So this is what Kripke was famous for as a student, was doing work in modal logic, the semantics of modal logic. So modality is kind of his baby that he's always been associated with. So what that is in general is, in this context at least, what we're talking about is when so if you take a proposition, say there's some proposition P, obviously a proposition can be either true or false. But we might want to say something else about that, in addition to it being a true proposition, it's the sort of proposition which could have been false, right? So it's contingent. We say that contingent is a sort of thing where it could be true, but it also could be false. And then we might think that there are other so for instance, contingent proposition, this glass is roughly half full of beer, right? It is true, but it could be false. In fact, it will be false in a little bit. Then there are necessary truths such that they are true, but they couldn't be false. So for instance, a candidate might be that 2 + 2 = 4, which is true, but there's somehow no way in which that could be false. And then the opposite of that would be proposition which is impossible, let's say 2 + 2 = 5 or something, which is false, and there's no way in which it could be true. I suppose the only other thing to say about these categories are kind of 4 categories that you get. And possible just means not impossible, whereas contingent means that it's neither necessary nor impossible. Anyway, I could draw you a picture and all of the lines connecting them up together would make perfect sense. So we've got these kind of properties that we can ascribe to propositions. So modality basically means the mode of truth, the way in which it's true. It's basically the kind of the etymological root to it. And what we're talking about here in particular is the idea of Kripke wants to distinguish between epistemic possibilities and metaphysical possibilities. And so we may want to say something like that it's epistemic. So there's an example, a sort of charming example that he uses in the text, which is something like maybe he doesn't say it exactly like this, but it's something like it's epistemically possible that you could find out that Nixon was in fact an inanimate object. He was a robot or something. Like you could find
automaton or whatever.
Right, exactly. And maybe things would happen such that all along he was in fact a robot. Right, and we were fooled by some super advanced evil genius that had made a robot to win the presidential election and then commit crimes or whatever. I don't know. But then the idea is that, like, given that he's not, it's somehow metaphysically impossible that Nixon, the flesh and blood guy, could have been an automaton. Right? There's kind of metaphysically impossible for him to have been an inanimate object or something, even though it's epistemically possible that I find out that he was in fact all along an inanimate object. Right? So we want to distinguish these two things. So sometimes when people say such and such is possible, if they don't explicitly state which type of possibility that they're talking about, it's another way that we can get confused and something that needs to be distinguished sharply from one another.
Right. Yeah, between between metaphysical and epistemic aspects. Right.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Those are the two. Yeah.
And just to clarify something, in the example that Kripke is using, that Alex was citing, the sense of metaphysical possibility there is the strongest sort of possibility, at least with respect to alethic modality, which Alex was just explaining. Because there's another distinction besides epistemic and metaphysical possibility, which would be something like physical possibility, what's consistent with the laws of nature, or what's consistent with the laws of physics, or whatever. We might say that, given human biology and this sort, it's impossible for Nixon to have been an automaton, as opposed to, composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and the sort. But that's just with respect to what satisfies our laws of physics. Metaphysical possibility is with respect to how the world has to be simplicator, period. So regardless of which laws of physics are turned out, regardless of how the world was, there's no way in which, given that Nixon is a human person, that he could have been an automaton. Or vice versa. If Nixon had been an automaton, then there's no way he could have been a human being. That's just, again, that's a stronger sense of possibility than either epistemic possibility, like Alex explained, which was just possibility as far as, given what we know, such and such could be the case, versus physical possibility, which is just what's consistent with the laws of nature. Metaphysical possibility just asks the question of what could be the case or what could not be the case, simplifier.
Yeah, I think it's actually quite hard to cash out very precisely what the difference is between metaphysical possibility and physical possibility. And
it doesn't help that some people think it doesn't help that some people think they're the same, I suppose.
Yeah, right. I mean, at least you can define physical possibility in terms of kind of current state of affairs, whether that's some kind of relativistic description of how things are, plus the laws of physics acting on that state of affairs or something, and that delineates in some sense what's possible, physically speaking. It's not clear that there's a corresponding set of laws that constitutes metaphysical restrictions. Like there's no metaphysical laws as such, or at least if there are, it's up to, very debatable what those things could be. So metaphysical possibility always seems to me, anyway, to stand in some kind of vague. It's not like it's defined by Kripke here. It's gestured towards as a kind of intuitive idea, and the examples given are supposed to give you an idea of what's going on with that. But nowhere is it kind of rigorously defined. I mean, we might say that there's another skin, like it's kind of like an onion where you've got like these additional layers going on with, like, I don't know, if you like, I mean, it kind of gets really complicated, but so maybe we've got epistemic possibilities in here, and then around the outside we've got like physical possibilities, and on the outside of that we've got metaphysical possibilities, in the sense that there are more each time. Like there are things that are metaphysically possible that are not physically possible, for instance. I mean, then you think that there's this kind of outer layer which is logically possible, right? Where there are things which are logically possible that are not metaphysically possible. So it means logically possible. Nixon was an automaton all along, because, I mean, does it break a logical law? Is there any, like, so logical possibility would just be defined as something like the way things are now, and the only thing constraining what's logically possible is the laws of logic. So anything that's compatible with what's true now and doesn't break a law of logic, say something like that. So, I mean, that's not a great way of describing it, but so you might think that there's a certain amount of things that are physically possible. There's more things that are metaphysically possible, and there's even more things which are logically possible, and they stand in this kind of relationship like that. But then to confuse this, the epistemic possibility is kind of dependent on, unlike those other ones, epistemic possibility is dependent on the agent. So I might have a weird outlook on things, and I might think that there are things, I might, I don't like the law of non-contradiction for some reason. Maybe Graham Priest, for instance, has a very good understanding of non-contradiction and thinks that doesn't always apply. I don't know. So for him, it's epistemically possible that there's some contradiction out there. So that's one way of. For him, something could be epistemically possible that's not logically possible for me. So the precise interrelationships between these types of modalities becomes very complicated. But we don't need to go into it too much. I mean, I suppose the general idea, really, as far as this is concerned, is that we want to keep distinct the way that certain scenarios, certain situations that we can describe can be described as possible on one sense, epistemically, possible in another sense, metaphysically. And those two things mean something very different. One of them means in relation to what I think is true, what I know, and the other one is in relation, as you said, to how things actually are, simplicity. That's the basic distinction that's going on here. Exactly what metaphysical possibility means doesn't matter too much for the purposes of this, I think. Hopefully I haven't confused things unnecessarily. I have a tendency to do that.
Unnecessarily or necessarily?
Epistemically necessary.
Well, maybe just to quickly follow up on that, just as an example to maybe just illustrate your point about how epistemic possibility can widely vary from metaphysical or perhaps even logical possibility. Somebody might sincerely form the belief that 237 is a prime number, right? Like you could ask them, and they think it could be a prime number. I don't think they have to even believe that it is a prime number. If you ask them, is 237 a prime number, they might answer the question, it could be, right? And it's clear that the sense of could in their sentence, it could be, is just referring to epistemic possibility, because presumably, given the way mathematics works, if 237 actually is prime, then it has to be prime. It's necessarily prime in some sense. And if it isn't prime, then it can't be prime. It's impossible that it's prime. As it turns out, it's not actually a prime number because it's divisible by 3. But nonetheless, so it's metaphysically impossible that 237 is prime. But nonetheless, for that person, it's epistemically possible, given their current state of knowledge, that it's a prime number. So epistemic possibility, like Alex was explaining, is just possibility with respect to one's current state of knowledge or one's current beliefs or whatnot. And obviously that can differ from person to person and from situation to situation. Some philosophers try to impose a more idealized constraint on it in terms of, we might consider epistemic possibility in terms of what an ideal agent, say given grasp of the relevant facts, would be able to conceive of. But I think that should make clear these distinctions that Alex is getting at between epistemic and metaphysical possibility.
Good.
Okay. Did we want to move? Did we? We dove in pretty pretty deep just then. Do we want to back up and kind of start? Um, it's tough because he was just kind of Alex and I were talking about this beforehand. And the lecture is a little unorganized in terms of there's kind of fits and starts within it and different examples that he comes up that he doesn't quite follow through on. But do we want to maybe start with? It seems like in the initial portion from like page 34 to 40 somewhere in there. He starts taking on wanting to uncouple necessary and a priori, and he gets into some things that I'm curious about, which he didn't really cover that much of, is the essentialism, the modality de re, is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm.
And advocacy of the necessity is modality de dicto. He kind of he juxtaposes those two at one point. I wasn't that's something we could go through a little bit. Did we want to maybe start off with the unnecessary or the necessary and a priori?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't want to talk too much, so I'm quite professional.
Or if anybody else wants to kind of dig into that.
Well, just as a really quick note, just on the historical context, like Alex had set up before about what Kripke was responding to, there was one thing I think that, obviously when we get to it, we'll be able to explain in more detail, but another thing that I guess Kripke would have been responding to in the series of lectures, when you were mentioning de re and the dictum modality, Quine famously had several attacks on this idea of de re modality with respect to a thing. What could a thing be, or what a thing had to be in particular. He wanted to say that didn't make any sense, absent some kind of spooky Aristotelian essentialism. And that was a fairly influential critique, which Kripke comes here to partially attack throughout these lectures.
Hypatia, that involves essential properties, right? That's what we're talking about.
Right. Like Quine just disparagingly says that you have to be some type of Aristotelian essentialist, in that you think there is in some sense natures of things that are independent of how we describe them, and he regarded that as, like he said, you had a choice. You could either adopt Aristotelian essentialism, or you could just drop this whole project of talking about de re modality or quantified modal logic in general. And he thought the choice was obvious. You just drop de re modality and quantified modal logic. Kripke, in a certain sense, resists that move.
Right.
But that's what we can explain when we actually get to that section or whatever.
So I guess maybe it would be helpful to point out as well here that whilst we saw Quine challenging these received dogmas of empiricism previously, in some respects Quine also is still an authority to be challenged by Kripke on exactly this type of attitude towards metaphysics. So in some senses, Kripke, David Lewis, these types of guys show how doing metaphysics stopped being really unfashionable. Like for people up to and including Quine, saying, well, this is Aristotelian metaphysics. It's like an insult that you're throwing at people. So logical positivists apparently used to go to conferences, and whenever anybody started to do anything, whenever anybody started to say anything that couldn't be empirically verified or reduced to logical relations, they would just say and talk over these people, get M for metaphysics, right? So it's kind of like boyish. Like it just sort of goes to show that like the kind of trends and fashions that go on in philosophy, and as Hypatia was saying, Quine would rather reject the metaphysical position than take on board some of these extra commitments and theoretical stuff that goes on with that. But Kripke kind of just says, no, I think it's kind of in some sense advocating a return to metaphysics. Which so we have these kind of conceptual turn, the linguistic turn. I think it's fair to say that in this period we're seeing something like a metaphysical turn, and much contemporary philosophy now is shaped by so people who did their philosophy growing up reading Kripke as an authority, whereas people before Kripke grew up reading people like Carnap or A.J. Ayer as an authority, or Wittgenstein as an authority, and they were all very anti-metaphysical. So
Right.
yes, that's some part of the context as well.
That you're touching on a little bit of when he argues that he says that there's some that argue that a priori knowledge can't be known empirically, right? And he's arguing against that. He says that's a mistake. That's a little bit what you were just talking about there, right? In terms of the prior thinking on it, in terms of a priori.
So what he's saying with that is that if we were to define a priori as knowledge which could only be arrived at by, or couldn't be arrived at by investigation of the world or something, then we would be missing out on, because so for instance, a priori means something that you could work out without looking at the world. So mathematical truths could be worked out by not looking at the world. However, you could also put mathematical calculation into a calculator and find out what the answer is. So that type of truth, that mathematical truth, is a priori in that you can figure it out without looking at the world. You just do the calculation in your head. You could also consult the world and it can tell you. So that's the distinction he's making there, is that it's wrong to say a priori is stuff that has to be figured out without investigation of the world. It could be figured out by an investigation of the world.
And they went so far as to say that it couldn't at all, right? The a priori, that's what I took from him, is that they were saying that a priori knowledge couldn't possibly be known by experience.
Well, I don't know. He didn't say who he's got in his mind there, and I'm not sure that. I mean, I think he's just saying if somebody was to say this, they'd be an idiot because of this, right? I'm not sure that he has anyone particular in mind there. I'm not sure that it doesn't sound to me like a necessary logical positivist doctrine, for instance. It's just a kind of, if
right, that's why
clumsily defined it like this, they'd be wrong. That's more like what that point was.
Okay.
I think it was just
that's
common view in philosophy. It's not necessarily specific to logical positivism.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was a little surprised at that. I took note of that. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to offer on this? Joe, did you have something you wanted to offer on it?
Well, I just wanted, I liked all the examples of contingent a priori concepts, like water equals H2O and the atomic number of gold, those types of things.
That's necessary a posteriori.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, you're
thinking
right.
of necessary a posteriori.
My bad.
Contingent a priori would be like his example of Julius is the inventor of the zip or something.
Yeah, he also uses the example of a meter stick, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, a meter stick is a meter long at time t equals 0 or something.
Water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Or not centigrade.
Yeah, centigrade.
Okay, so maybe it would be worth then going into detail about one of these examples to show what's going on here and how it can be. That's something.
Well, have we delineated between like Bert was talking about earlier, between the a priori, the analytic, and the necessary, though? I mean, we did, I think, a good job of tackling necessity versus, just necessity in general. But, I mean, I think we might want to, before we get into that, just for the sake of the viewers, just to lay out what the a priori is as Kripke sees it, what the analytic is, and then how Kripke sees those three distinctions. It's not a trivial thing to say that all three are coextensive or they refer to the same thing, at any rate.
Yeah. He didn't go into analytic that much. He kind of glazed over it, but certainly with he seems to be arguing. Well, if somebody else wants to go, let me know, because my notes are fairly vague at this point. I felt like I hit my stride as I got deeper into it. Helena, you've been quiet.
Yes, Helena has been quiet. She must have stuff to say. Or not.
She does not.
Did she step away?
She may have. Okay, so well, I got he went quickly from the necessary and a priori into the essential properties, and that's where I was gathering um, his concept of necessary. But I wasn't sure if that was. It seemed like he was arguing for intuition at some point, but I don't think that's. That seems like that's touching on what you were referring to earlier, Alex, in terms of Quine and what he was kind of battling against.
Yeah, okay, sure. So that bit where he says about well, if somebody says that's intuitive, then, or if somebody says that's unintuitive, then they're just wrong about that. I found that was quite interesting, actually, but where is that? Do you have that to hand?
It's between 34 and 38, but let me see.
Is it? Oh, right, I'm way further.
It's 41 maybe. At the top of 41.
Okay, yeah, right, good.
Yeah, intuitive content, right.
Yeah, oh, okay, yes, right. So
That sounds like he's talking about the ray modality here.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, that's right. So it's essentially saying that that I think the idea is that Quine's kind of position on this is something like, look, if you've got a claim of necessity and a kind of necessity claim about something, like one of his examples is something like, you could say that a mathematician is necessarily rational or something. But his idea is something like, the ascription of rationality to the mathematician is only in virtue of being described as a mathematician. It's like it's necessary to be a mathematician that you be rational. Described in another way, the same mathematician could be described as only contingently rational, because as people, you can have a brain hemorrhage or something that would diminish your capacity to be rational. So whether you're necessarily rational or contingently rational is entirely dependent on the way that you describe the person. And that is an argument in itself, some type of argument, that's suggesting that all modality is de re, and that means that it's of the word rather than of the thing. That's what the Latin kind of root for that is. So he's trying to say.
Exactly uses this with the bicyclist, right? Like the bicyclist is essentially two-legged, but only contingently rational. The mathematician is presumably necessarily rational, but only contingently two-legged. So what happens when you have a mathematical bicyclist? So yeah.
Sure. So, but general point though is that the ascription of the modality, like whether it's a necessary truth or a contingent truth or an impossible truth, whatever, it's entirely dependent on the way in which it's described. Not, as a de re reading would say, it's entirely dependent on the properties of the thing. So he's got this kind of he's got this view on modality whereby things don't have a kind of profile which determines their necessary and contingent properties, right?
Right.
That's not a property of things. It's not what they're like. And he thinks that that's an intuitive way of looking at things. And Kripke's just saying, well, so it gets kind of more complicated because I suppose it's helpful to tie in these ideas to the kind of central doctrine that Kripke's arguing for here, which is about how names work. It seems like it might be not directly related to this topic, and yet it kind of is for Kripke's ideas. So what Kripke wants to say is that names are what he classifies as a rigid designator. What that means is that if you refer to something by its name, say Nixon or Alex or Bert or something, then the way that name functions modally is that it picks out the same object in every world in which that object exists. Right? So it's just like if you say, well, what if Bert had fallen over and grazed his knee? And we might think, well, what we have to do is go to a possible world, like not the actual world, this world, but a different world, possible world where things are different, and find Bert and see whether in that world Bert has such and such properties. Right? What if Bert grazed his knee? Would he be crying? Something like that. Right? You might think that you say, well, let's go to the other world in our mind or something, find Bert and see whether or not he's got his grazed knee and he's crying. Something like that. Right? This is kind of general idea in the background. And then you might think, well, there's this kind of general problem of like, well, if it's easy to see who Bert is in that world, like if it's very similar to this world, then I can find him, right? But that's only because the qualities of this other possible Bert are very similar to this Bert. But you might say something like, what if things were drastically different? Like, what if Bert had been, abandoned by his parents when he was young and brought up by gypsies and taken across Europe, circus or something, right? What would Bert be doing now? Something like this kind of crazy, outlandish possibility. And then we might think, well, if we travel to that world and try and find Bert, there'd be very few things in common between this Bert and that one. He might have different color hair, he might only have one arm because he might have had an accident under a tractor or something. It might be very, very difficult to pick out the same object qualitatively. And if we go to even more outlandish possibilities, we start to think like that we need a set of criteria for identifying the same object across worlds for us to be able to always say that we're talking about the same thing in different possibilities. So this is basically the way that the Kripke thinks that the theory of descriptions would have to handle reference to things in other possibilities, right? Because if Bert is, the meaning of the term Bert is, this American guy works for DreamWorks or whatever, once we start going off to distant possible worlds where things are all different, as long as those things with which we've used to pick the reference out have all failed to apply, so he's not got this color hair, he doesn't have that shirt on, doesn't live in this city, doesn't have this job, then we stop being able to refer to him. In fact, the definite description fails to pick him out. It might pick a different person out. Right? So we might have the case where we're considering a different possible world and we're actually talking about somebody else entirely. Okay, so Kripke wants to say, well, forget that. That's one reason why we think that the theory of names whereby their meaning is that there's definite description, that's kind of wrong. What we should do is instead think of talking about a name is a rigid designator, and what that just means is that it picks out the same thing in every world in which it exists. So I would just start with that as a kind of stipulation at the beginning of that's how names work. Okay, so if we go back to what we were talking about a moment ago, we want to say something like, okay, let's think about, could Nixon have lost the, whatever it is, 1968 general election, the presidential election, which he won? Could it be that Nixon lost that election? Well, if we had associated the description with Nixon as the winner of the 1968 presidential election, then it's a kind of a necessary truth that he won the 1968 presidential election, right? Because we're basically saying, could the winner of the 1968 presidential election not be the winner of the 1968 presidential election? Obviously, that seems to be no. What we want to say is something like, could this guy have lost the 1968 presidential election? And the answer to that seems to be yes, he could have done. So by switching to this preferable theory of names, what we end up doing is using a kind of Dewey view of modality, which actually gives us the right answer on questions where if we were to be a good Quinean about it, we would have to kind of give the wrong answer, or at least we would have to come up with ever more fancy ways of describing the object to guarantee that the reference worked in every case. Something like that. So I'm trying to tie together the sorry. I'm going to tie together the move towards Dewey modality and the underlying kind of semantical, logical point about using names in a particular. The attack on descriptions is kind of tied with this move back towards metaphysics again.
Right.
Let me shut up now.
He's looking for a way to. So I mean, in essence, and this is going to sound completely obvious, but he's finding a way that we determine the meaning of a name. And he's saying that with these rigid designators, and he talks about fixing the reference on something, and eventually gets in like we're not within this, I'm not even sure within these 3 lectures, but he sets up the kind of the causal theory, the grounds for the causal theory of reference. That's the way you lock on essentially a name to something. And so when you go into talking about Nixon and these possible worlds, and none of the characteristics of the Nixon in the actual world can be found in these possible worlds, that you're not referring to Nixon. You're setting up a well, I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but you're setting up taking the Nixon that you know and then creating these caveats. You're just kind of tossing these. You're stipulating essentially properties that are not of the Nixon that you know, and that's what you're referring to, right?
Yes. Okay. So I think it's a good idea not to possibly mix together two slightly different things. So there's the so the idea of rigid designation in itself doesn't have to have a causal element to it, right? However, there is the causal theory of reference, which he is an advocate of. Also something that Hilary Putnam comes up with. They kind of both come up with it together. And that's like saying something like this. It's another reason to reject the descriptions theory of meaning for names, right? Because if you say something like, look, so Aristotle, right? Aristotle, what does that mean? Well, it's this guy, right? This guy from history, the guy who was the student of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great or something. If that's the way that the description, so if that's the way that we know what Aristotle means, then what happens if at some point later on down the line somebody digs up a scroll and they find out that this whole Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great thing was just a kind of propaganda thing that Alexander the Great's guys came up with to make him sound really clever or something, right? Let's say that happens. What now? Do we see previously that all of the times in the past when everyone used the word Aristotle, they actually failed to refer to anything because they were using a description which didn't uniquely pick out this object? I mean, is that what you'd say? And so he says, you know, that's obviously wrong. We would say even though that description failed to pick out this guy, we were still referring to him in the first place. So how is that the case? And the idea is something like, well, there was an initial baptism some point in the past where maybe his parents sat Aristotle down or whatever. They came up with this idea. They said, we're going to have our son, we're going to call him Aristotle. And they just decide between maybe sign a piece of paper and it gets submitted to Athens or something. I don't know how it works. It doesn't matter, right? But there's some baptism ceremony that goes on where his parents decide what his name's going to be. It doesn't have to be a baptism in a kind of religious sense, whatever. It's just a naming. Somehow they came up with this name. And then they said to their friends, when they said, what's your son going to be called? Hey, he's going to be called Aristotle. And Aristotle went around, people asked him, what's your name? He said, Aristotle, right? So there are these things that happen that starts a kind of causal sequence of events. And that chain of events continued through history until we were using the word Aristotle. And everybody down the line is using the word Aristotle in the same way because we're in a long causal sequence that means that's what guarantees the fact that we took. So I might not be able to say anything about Aristotle. And it might be that everything I think I know about Aristotle is false. So he's not the teacher of Alexander the Great. He wasn't a philosopher. Maybe he was the plumber of the philosopher. He just came round and whatever, some history mixed up their names or something, right? It doesn't matter. If everything I think I know about the name Aristotle is wrong, it doesn't mean that I'm not referring properly. If, you know, the causal, I am actually referring successfully to someone because I'm at the end of a causal sequence that starts with a baptism. So it's not quite the same as, obviously, referring with the rigid designator to Nixon in another possible world. I'm not actually causally related to something in a different possible world. And Kripke doesn't really want us to think that possible worlds are real kind of concrete things. His view of possible worlds is vague, but certainly non-realist, and certainly not the sort of thing that we can have a causal relation to as such. So I just wanted to keep those two things like slightly separate from each other. Rigid designator and causal theory of reference.
Yeah, that when I had a framework to think of it otherwise, it helped me understand what his issues were, what the issues were that he was laying out with the past. So I recognized that it wasn't actually talked about in here, but it gives me kind of a compass point essentially to compare against how one might do it. But
just before we move on, as it's interesting, and as I just brought this up anyway, so if we're talking about just very quickly, the causal theory of reference is developed by other people as well, like Hilary Putnam, as a kind of externalist semantics in general. I mean, externalism in epistemology kind of also has its same root in this general idea, as a lot of very important ideas do. They kind of trace their roots back to things that Kripke said, right? But it's very important to see this. The idea here is that the meaning of a term that you have is somehow like causally related to something outside of you. So when I say something like, you know, the glass or whatever, assuming circumstances are not such that I'm not hallucinating or whatever, normal circumstances, and I'm kind of like causally related to this thing in front of me that's hitting my eyes and giving me sensations. And crucially, when I talk about it, there's some kind of causal relation that makes the reference successful. And this forms the basis of an argument that Putnam has against solipsism and skepticism about the external world. Because if the causal theory of reference is right, then simply by talking about things properly and the right circumstances, when we're not hallucinating, being inadvertently drugged or whatever, we do succeed in talking about the external world. It's quite a simple theory, but it's just saying, like, if this otherwise plausible causal theory is right, then when we talk about things in the external world, we are actually talking about things in the external world. I mean, it's a very rough thing. It's quite interesting because people pop around on the internet saying that there's no way to talk about the problem of hard solipsism or whatever. There's loads. This is just one, right? And it's kind of brought into a very plausible, otherwise plausible semantic framework. And anyway, yes, I'll shut up now. Sorry.
Don't shut up for too long. What I want to do is bring it back to necessity and a priori and a necessary. And I guess now that we've talked about, when we got into talking about Nixon in possible worlds not having any of the properties of Nixon, that gets into the essential properties and the accidental properties and what you can call away while still be talking about Nixon. And so when we get into talking about those things, I understand where he's at with the necessary. And what's less clear to me is the uncoupling of the a priori, like why that was important, or what where he was. I understood much more about his talk regarding the necessary than I did about the a priori. So can we talk maybe a little bit of why those two, like I understand if you're thinking of those things, two things going together, why you'd want to decouple them, but is there any other point to it in his lecture?
Well, I mean, I think there, like Alex was getting it earlier, at least back to Kant, if not before. I mean, we can leave aside the analytic for now, but people have taken the necessary and the a priori to, if not to be one and the same, even if you take them to have different meanings, we could say in some sense that they refer to the same concept, is what I think people want to say. If something is a priori, then it has to be necessary, and if something is necessary, then it has to be a priori, presumably. And he gives an illustration of this, I think, in his example, because my notes have the wrong page numbers here because I used the old PDF, so I'm not sure which page this refers to. Let me see if I can find it. There's a line that he gives.
If you say it, I might have it written down.
It starts like something like, if something not only happens to be true in the actual world, but is also true in all possible worlds, then of course just by running through all the possible worlds in our head, we ought to be able with enough effort to see if a statement is necessary, that it is necessary, and thus know it a priori. But really this is not so obviously feasible at all. And not sure which page this is in the original book.
It's 38.
Oh,
It's
wow.
38. Oh, okay.
It's on the middle of 38, I think.
Right. So, I mean, there's a sort of picture that, well, how is it we could come to know that something is necessarily true? Well, the idea is supposed to be that, presumably, what's necessarily true is what has to be true, in the strongest sense, it has to be true. And there's sort of no other way we could determine that other than just by some faculty of, rational insight or whatever, of being able to determine that beyond just, going through this list of worlds in our head in some fashion. But Kripke just doesn't think that, well, first of all, we don't, literally go through that list, because presumably that list is infinite. But regardless, as Kripke goes on to, as he talked about, I think, before that page and later on, it's not a trivial thing. Or at the very least, it would be an interesting discovery or argument to the effect that what is a priori is necessary, and what is necessary is a priori. It's not clear that the two have to be one and the same in any fashion. And he famously goes on to give examples of truths that are contingent but a priori, and truths that are necessary but known a posteriori instead. And again, we talked about this a little bit in the last hangout you had on Quine and Two Dogmas, where you have these three distinctions throughout history, at least back to Kant, if not before, between the analytic and the synthetic, between the a priori and the a posteriori, and between the necessary and the contingent. The analytic-synthetic distinction is a semantical distinction. It concerns the truth of things in relation to their meanings. The a priori, a posteriori distinction is an epistemological distinction. It concerns how it is we come to know a given truth. And the necessary contingent distinction is a metaphysical distinction. It concerns the way the world is or has to be, in some sense. And obviously it's not trivial to say that the three are one and the same. I think that's all, like, up to this part, like in the first lecture, like, page 38, 39, 40 or so, I think that's all he's currently getting at. Like, he hasn't given these examples yet of, like, how you decouple them, but I think he's just stage setting that there's this unargued for presumption that they are one and the same, and that we can see that given, like, once we realize that, they're tracking different distinctions, it isn't trivial to argue that they are one and the same. And he goes on later to give examples where he does uncouple them.
Yeah, that was why I think I found, like, I got rolling after page 42 or whatever. Like, it was much easier to kind of just sift, just move right through all the examples. Did you want to talk about the analytic other than that it was coupled to the other two?
Well, one thing I didn't want to bring up there, not necessarily in relation to this hangout but in the past hangout, I don't know if you recall, but the way Quine set up the circularity argument that was central to his attack on analyticity was he wanted, like, the logical positivists, right? They wanted to, like, what was their take on analyticity? Well, they analyze analyticity in terms, like the way Quine sets it up. Analyticity is analyzed in terms of synonymy. Synonymy, given in intentional language, is analyzed in terms of necessity, but the necessity itself is analyzed in terms of analyticity, so you've just gone in a circle and gone nowhere, basically, right? The core presumption there was that necessity is analyzed in terms of analyticity, and of course he goes later on to dissociate necessity from analyticity. So I had said in that hangout that if you gave up this assumption that necessity is analyzed in terms of analyticity, maybe Quine's argument doesn't quite have as much force. So this bit about uncoupling actually has some continuity, I think, with the Two Dogmas paper that we had done a hangout on like a month ago or whatever. So this uncoupling that Kripke does, affects obviously not just views on modality and philosophy of language, but it may also have some relevance to Quine's attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction.
Yes. Oh, there goes Joe. Hi, Joe. That was something I definitely noticed when you were talking about the circularity. I definitely noticed through Kripke's argument the shadows of that objection throughout the text. Or, sorry. So, do we want to move into this section kind of up to like page 44, 42 to 44 is the getting into, like I said, the essential properties, accidental properties, or necessary and contingent, and a priori, and kind of getting through to the examples. Did we want to go through some of these, or did we want to? How do we want to proceed from here?
So there's the sorry, there's someone talking.
I was just going to say that he was getting into the possible worlds. That when he says, when he starts talking about the different examples with Nixon, Hood.
So maybe it's helpful to contrast what Kripke is saying here with what some other people were saying. So the kind of extreme contrary view to the one that Kripke is arguing for is David Lewis's, where on his view it's called counterpart theory, and on that view it's something like no one thing exists at two worlds. So you can't say something like this Bert who lives in the actual world with me is the same guy as this other Bert in a different possible world. Strictly speaking, Bert only is confined to one world on David Lewis's view, and the other guy in the other possible world with the grazed knee who's crying or whatever the example. Sorry, that was a terrible example to give, but
it's better than the gypsy.
Okay, so that guy is not Bert, but he's sufficiently similar to Bert to constitute Bert's counterpart in that world. And Lewis has a very elegant logic and semantical theory, counterpart theory, where he has his own kind of quantified modal logic based on these principles. Kripke wants to kind of contrast with that altogether, and so his view, in a sense, is kind of radical. Is kind of pitting. Modal logic is something that he, like as Hypatia was saying in the first place, it was going on for a while before Kripke came along. It's a kind of a 20th century thing that it became. I'm going to backtrack even more. It's not a 20th century; it's an Aristotelian thing, right? But with the advances of logic that we were talking about in the first lecture, naturally other aspects that were in traditional logic were kind of reimagined in the modern setting, and modality was one of these things. Like, how do we think about modality? Now we've got the resources of modern logic. And there were a bunch of logicians who were kind of trying to figure out how modal logic would work in this setting. Right? People like C.S. Lewis is the guy, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? But right, the other, there's all these Lewises floating around.
His less famous brother.
Yeah, right. He was this logician from Harvard or something who came up with a whole bunch of. He didn't like the material conditional, which is one of the things that is new to modern logic with Russell's Principia Mathematica. They have this idea that the conditional is true in every case apart from when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. And this leads to all sorts of weird consequences. And this guy, Lewis, was early 20th century Lewis, didn't like that, and he kind of tried to adapt the modern logic in such a way that it didn't have these weird consequences. And one of the things he did was he said we should think about the conditional in a different way. What the conditional should say is that it's not possible that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Not just that it's true that the antecedent, that it's not true that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, but it couldn't be. And so he added a modal element in to try and avoid these paradoxes of material implication. So it's kind of a weird way of adding in modality to logic, but nevertheless, that's where it came from. And then he started charting out, well, because this new conditional is modal and it's not truth functional, not strictly speaking truth functional, we have to figure out, well, what inferences follow from what when we've got this new conditional involved. How do we do that? So he had to come up with a couple of inference rules and a bunch of axioms to chart that. Then he realized that actually there's lots of different ways that you could cache this out. And so we started making systems called S1, S2, S3, blah, blah, blah. And I think he had 9 or 14 or something like this. But interesting thing happened when he came up to S4 is that the kind of a more coherence came to the property of you can eliminate a load of the otherwise unnecessary combinations of operations. You could just say this bunch of stuff over here is just equivalent to this very small section of stuff over here, which makes a lot of things very easy. So proving things is very easy because you can just prove via these interactions of this bunch of stuff over here. We can just rewrite that as this, and that's easy to manipulate. Blah blah blah. And S5, the whole thing collapses down to just 5 different particular things that you can say. So from a logician's point of view, what becomes very, very intractable and difficult to negotiate becomes extremely easy, beautifully easy, in fact. So there is this system floating around S5 which had independently interesting mathematical properties, right? And the question was, what kind of like, why? What was it that was going on? And it had already been noticed beforehand that that there may be some kind of relationship between the modality that was going on in S5 and the ideas of quantification that we got from first order logic, the modern logic of Frege and Russell. So that there's, in some sense, you could map these two things onto one another, and people would. It's a race to the finish thing. It's like Jacko Hintekar, this other guy called von Wright. They were publishing papers around this time, the end of the 50s, kind of getting towards the idea that they could classify these the semantics of this system properly and prove all of the things they needed to prove. And Kripke beat them to it. And the way he did it was. So von Wright's got this weird idea of kind of these geometrical shapes, and if you think about them as the semantics of the logic, then it kind of mimics quantification. Kripke comes along and says, like, I'm taking this weird, like, Leibnizian idea that we've got, like, all of these possible worlds out there, and if we think of that as the model, then we can, in the semantics, we can use quantifiers, and that maps on perfectly to the operators in the symbolic language that we've got. But he proved that if you think about the semantics in this way, the whole thing becomes like perfectly matched, and that means anything you want to say in the object language you can say in the semantics. And that's what he did. Is kind of the completeness theorem for S5 is him saying possible worlds theory, when thought of in this particular way, is the appropriate semantics for this independently, otherwise mysteriously interesting, kind of beautiful mathematical theory. So that's what he did. That's why that's like the Michael Jackson achievement. Like, he's a teenage kid here, somehow manages to figure all of that out whilst he's at high school. Like, yeah, it's amazing. But anyway, so the point is, now this idea of possible worlds is on the scene. All of these philosophers who are kind of hearing about this, getting to grips with it, the logicians and the philosophers are kind of getting together and saying that we need to now understand this idea, blah, blah, blah. This is kind of like possible worlds. What does that mean? How do we think about it? What are the issues here? What's the metaphysics? What's the implications generally? So at one end of the extreme on this particular debate, which is like, what do we mean by possible worlds? How do individuals exist within this kind of framework? What does it mean to say that somebody exists in a possible world, blah, blah, blah. So we've got this on the one hand, David Lewis over here, who kind of strongly advocates for the view that individuals are world-bound, right? These are kind of isolated pockets of existence in which you can't exist, you know, straddling one foot in two worlds. You're stuck in one world and not in another one. Whereas Kripke, on the other hand, is thinking about it in a completely different way, something along the lines of, very, very briefly, it's something along the lines of, like, he thinks that a possible world is like a way that the future could be, something like this. So, right, like, I face various different futures. For instance, for this evening, I could just kind of go and cook dinner and then sit and watch the TV, or I could go out for a meal and then go to the pub, right? But both of those possibilities of things are in front of me, and it's equally me that's in both of those two futures, right? So when we're talking about what could have happened to me, like I could have missed this hangout and been in the pub already, what we're doing is you kind of trace backwards in time to some point in my past and then branch off from that into the possible future that existed at that point, right? So you can sort of trace down, and you're tracking back with me the whole way. And then just as now, where I've got these futures available and I'm in all of them, you can say, well, at that point I had all these futures available to me. We just take a route up, say to the left or something, which is where I went to the pub, and I do something differently. But this idea is I'm tracking backwards within the same world and identifying a possibility that existed in this world for me, this same person, me. Right? And in that way, I'm not jumping off into another world. They don't really exist as a separate place. He says we don't discover them by looking through telescopes. They're too far away for us to go to, this type of thing. Right? We're just supposed to imagine these possibilities existing for me. It's kind of a de re view of the modality in general. And so that's why we can anchor the possibilities and tether them to the individuals. We're talking about, like, hey, this guy over here with the martini glass in his hand, yeah, that guy could have been the president of America or something like that. We're saying that at some point in his past, this possibility was available to him, something like that. I feel like I may have wandered off topic a little bit too much.
Just out of curiosity, though, when you were describing that branching view of possibility, is that basically how Kripke arrives at origin essentialism? That at least what is essential to you and I and others are how we causally originated, say, the union of a particular sperm and egg, because otherwise we wouldn't be tracking, like if Alex is the union of this particular sperm and egg, if we looked at another situation where we were looking at a different causal origin, we would be tracking someone else, not Alex. So it's everything from that origin onwards where we can sort of branch offwards and say we're still tracking Alex. Given that origin, we can do that, but once you sort of move beyond that, then there's no fact of the matter as to whether we're tracking Alex or someone else entirely.
Yeah, that's
or I guess rather he would say we are tracking someone else entirely.
Is that the fixing the referent, or?
No, the idea is that, Kripke gets at certain interesting metaphysical claims. I mean, one of the most interesting at the end of this book, which is that, some type of dualism has to be true. But one of the metaphysical claims he makes is, with respect to origins, what he wants to say one of the Dirac properties for things are that we rigidly designate or whatever. Like if I talk about this table or if I talk about you and I or whatever, I think one of the examples that he uses is that his lectern, given that it was made out of wood, it was created out of wood, it could not have been made out of ice instead. And the idea is that he wants to say that the origin of a thing is part of what makes that thing, that individual thing in question. And I think that ties in nicely with what Alex was getting at with this sort of branching view of possibility that Kripke is getting at, because we can only tether things within that branch to the extent that we're still talking about what shares the causal history of that object in question. But the causal history of that object begins with its causal origination. So you have to actually be talking about the same thing. In that when you use the name Alex, you have to be talking about if in the actual world Alex is the union of a particular sperm and egg, then in every world where the word Alex is apt in this sense, it has to be talking about whatever was a result of that, again, same sperm and egg. Otherwise, we would be talking about somebody completely different because you'd be looking at a different causal origin, and then you wouldn't have the same branching view that Alex was describing that Kripke has, as opposed to Lewis's counterpart theory.
Can I ask a question as it relates to so if we take your example with the pub, and we're talking about the rigid, he talks about the rigid designator being that something is a rigid designator if in every possible world it refers to the same object, right? It designates the same object.
Well,
and then
in every world in which that thing exists, right? So
right.
I don't exist in every world. There are worlds. I'm not a necessary being, unfortunately. I'm a contingent being. So there are worlds in which I don't exist. But every world in which I do exist, the name Alex refers to me. Right.
Right.
So the difference is just that you said that it refers to the same thing in every world. But the caveat it refers to every world in which that thing exists.
He says let's call something a rigid designator if in every possible world it designates the same object. A non-rigid or accidental designator if that is not the case.
Wait, where does
I was
going
to ask. It says that on page 48.
I think later on, though, I'd have to look at the book, but he also distinguishes that from what's a strongly rigid designator, where a strongly rigid designator designates a necessarily existent object.
Yeah, I mean, if you keep reading,
like on page 48, it says, of course, we don't require that objects exist in all possible worlds, etc., etc. So, like Alex was saying, in every world where it exists, it picks out the same object.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're, let's say you were to posit a possible world where you went to the pub instead, would that be that would still be a rigid designator because you're still referring to the same object, yeah. But what would be an example of a non-rigid or an accidental designator?
Definite descriptions, mostly, I think. It's like doesn't he contrast that, like with respect to fixing the reference? So, like, if you went to the pub with a red cap on, we might use the description, you're in the pub, and I see somebody shadowy in the corner of the pub, but I see they have a red cap. I say, well, there's this guy over here with a red cap on, right? Now, presumably, it's not the case in every possible world. You have a red cap on, even when you're at that pub. in that situation or something. So in that sense, the description, the man with the red cap on, would serve as an accidental or non-rigid designator. It's a definite description in this case, which Alex or somebody else could fail to satisfy.
Yeah, so if I said, like, the guy with the red cap on might not have come to the pub, right? But that would entail would be that there'd be the guy sitting at home still with his red cap on, right? Okay, that seems to work the same as the name in that sense. But if I said, like, the guy with the red cap on might have had a glass of wine instead of a glass of beer. If you think about a world where the guy takes his cap off, someone else puts a red cap on, and he's drinking a glass of beer, right? Then the definite description is picking that guy out. It's picking this other guy out, right? So it would seem that the reference in that other possible world has changed from what this person to that person, right? So if the meaning of the term "the guy with the red cap on," or sorry, if the meaning of like that guy was not George or whatever his name is, it wasn't a thing which stayed fixed from world to world, but just followed around the property of having a red cap on and being in the pub, right? And you want to say this guy with red cap in the pub is drinking a beer, but we'll slot that out for drinking a glass of wine instead. Is that possibility? Is that true? Is that a possible? Is there a possible world in which that actually happens to be the case? And there might be a possible world in which it actually happens to be the case, but it's a different guy who satisfies these two properties, right? Who's drinking, has a red cap on, he's in the pub, he's drinking a glass of wine. It's a different guy. So we would say that in that case, the definite description is not rigid, precisely because the referent changes from world to world. Like the properties still manage to pick out a unique referent, but it's just a different one from in this world. And so then he's saying that basically, if you're trying to track, it's an idea of like kind of tracking objects from world to world, if you hold fixed properties to do so, precisely because in the other worlds different people have the different properties that you're talking about, you stop tracking reference properly and you start losing the thing that you're actually referring to and end up by accident referring to a different thing. Like if I say Nixon could have lost the general election, that's true, but if I say the guy who won, the winner of the presidential election could have not been the winner of the presidential election, that's false. But so in a sense, I've like stopped tracking Nixon, and maybe I've tracked Humphrey now because he was the guy who was running against. Obviously, in that world where Nixon lost, Humphrey won. It's still true that the guy who won, right? So but the reason that takes on the wrong truth value is because it stopped talking about Nixon and it started talking about Humphrey. So that's how it's non-rigid.
Would Lewis say that it's never the same Alex? Is that what Lewis would say, or somebody like Lewis?
No, but strictly speaking, it's never the same Alex. But when we say things like Alex could have been 6 feet tall, what we mean is there is some other guy who sufficiently resembles Alex in another possible world, and he is tall, 6 feet tall, whatever. So
that would be Lewis's response.
That's Lewis's. That's what Lewis thinks is the truth condition for the sentence. It's true that it's possible that Alex could have been 6 feet tall.
Whereas Kripke would say we are referring to Alex.
Well, yeah, he would say something like, if it's true,
one and the same, yeah.
Yeah, I would be talking about the same guy, and I'd be saying about him that in another possible world, this guy, Alex, is in fact 6 feet tall there, rather than there's some other guy who's sufficiently similar to him and he's 6 feet tall. So then kind of the criticism that that Kripke has about David Lewis's view is he says something like, look, on Lewis's view, when Nixon may have said to himself, damn it, or something like, phew, I almost lost that general election. I could have lost that general election. Kripke says, look, Nixon isn't saying, phew, a guy sufficiently similar to me in another world did lose the general election. Right? He wouldn't care about what happens to someone else who's not him but sufficiently similar to him. What difference does that make? Like, he cares about what could have happened to him. Right? So he sees that as an argument against Lewis's counterpart theories. It doesn't really account for why you would care about possibilities, because they don't really affect you. They're not really about you. They're about other people. Whereas Kripke's like, no, they're about you. Like, it's like full-on de re, like property has the possibility itself, kind of thing.
And Kripke sees the root of this being the confusion over metaphysical and epistemological, right? The priority and necessity. It seems like that was his issue with the confusion over counterfactuals. Well,
I think the right way to look at this is that his primary target here is the descriptivist theory of names, for which he wants to present the rigid designated theory of names, and then everything else follows from that. Right? So once you've got the rigid designated theory of names in place, you can say, what I may have said Nixon could have been an automaton, but really what I meant in that case, the only way that that was like epistemically possible was it was something like, the guy who has the qualities of being, the crooked president or whatever.
The actual Nixon, and then you're swapping in these other properties, essentially.
Right. So the whole thing, I see it as really fundamentally, this book just is one idea, which in a kind of neat way about this idea of I don't like the descriptivist theory, I like this rigid designated theory, and then everything in it, I was talking about this theory of branching possibilities or something. Everything else he has to say in the book grows out of that one kind of seed of insight, and so all the other things I would say are just corollaries of that one kind of technical move. Anyway, I'm really sorry, but I have to go. So I'm going to have to leave you there. Hopefully I've been of some help anyway. And I look forward to watching the rest of this later on.
Not at all. Have fun.
All right, yeah.
Thanks for coming.
No trouble. I will in fact be in the pub. That possible resume, I'm going to actualize that now. So, yeah.
If you see a gypsy named Bert, help him with his knee, would you?
Yeah, I'll give him a red cap and help him with his knee. All right. I'll see you later.
Goodbye.
Bye, Alex. Okay, and then Helena's going to have to unmute at some point because Hypatia and I, or Hypatia, you can just step up as well. Part of it is that the difficulty is that when I get through this stuff, it's the type of thing where you read it and you go, oh, okay, I got it, I understand that, and then you get into a conversation about it, and it's very difficult to actually structure. You realize that you don't have it as well as you have it, so it's
right.
These are always fun for me because these are my first time through these texts, which is both wonderful. But that was kind of what I was hoping for these things.
Right.
Well, I'm in the same boat.
I tend to. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm in the same boat, probably worse boat than you're in, right? So, but what I think helped me with this is this idea of stipulation and why we think about possible worlds at all, right? We don't do it in order to decide, whether or not that table is that table. We just stipulate that table and then imagine what would circumstances be like if that table were somewhere else, as an example, right? Same thing with people, right? So it's not, I have trouble seeing what the problem is, right? Because, when we want to talk about, what would happen if Bert were in this other circumstance, we don't suddenly go, but wait, where's Bert? Right? We just stipulate, let's put him in that other circumstance and imagine what could happen. So it seems like it feels like either I understand what he's saying, or maybe people are making a lot of brouhaha out of not too much. But it seems like we lose the reason why anybody ever thinks about possible, scenarios. And if in fact the thing we cared about was whether or not Bert would be Bert, then that's the thing we would be talking about.
There's a great bit that he says here, which I laughed out loud when I was reading it, because it was just like you said. It was like, oh my gosh, yes, how stupid. He says, so we do not begin with worlds which are supposed to somehow be real and whose qualities but not whose objects are perceptible to us, and then ask about criteria of trans-world identification. On the contrary, we would begin with objects which we have and can identify in the actual world, and then can ask whether certain things might not have been true of the objects.
I can understand if we were in a particular circumstance where the very thing we were wondering about was, is this table that table in that other world? But most of the time, whoever really wants to do that, most of the time we're using this idea of other possible worlds by taking something in our world and implanting it into that other possible world, and we just stipulate that that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I thought it was the line that got me was whose qualities but not whose objects are perceptible to us. That was hilarious. Oh, nerd humor.
Well, he uses, I mean, I think this is basically concordant with Helena's point, but he uses I think an example or an illustration that, like she was talking about, possible worlds are stipulated, they're not discovered. It's not like we're literally peering through some modal telescope to see at possibilities and then matching them up with ours. We just stipulate that such and such is the case. I think it goes into that like in page 43, 44 or something. But yeah, I mean, we just stipulate that such and such is the case, where we start with the objects in the world, and like Helena was saying, we just project them outwards into these other possibilities.
He gets into that definitely when he starts talking about the meter stick, right? Because he says that that's a priori, right? Like you're stipulating what a meter is, but that that it's not a necessary truth because it could vary over time, right? So there's the time modality.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not sure what page that's on, but that's where he, like we had talked.
54.
54.
So the meter stick thing, you guys need to help me out with this. I kind of understood his basic idea was that we're fixing the referent, right, by that particular stick.
Mm-hmm.
But that particular stick could have actually been a different length, right? And so there's something wrong with the way we're looking at it. And what I couldn't quite or can't remember is he talking about contingent things being a priori, or is he talking about necessary things?
Well, he's naming, right? The guy that is determining what is 1 meter is naming, right? They're fixing that that's 1 meter, and then I think that's where he's arguing that that's a case of a priori knowledge.
And then he's saying, but the problem
is,
even though it's contingent, so this is about contingent a priori stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing he wanted to, and you guys might have talked about this while I was running around outside, but the other thing he wanted to bring up was there was one that was, contingent a priori can exist, and then the other one was necessary.
Necessary a posteriori.
Yeah. Is that right? Can you remind me which example he used to try to make that point?
Does he talk about that in the first lecture? I don't recall.
The necessary a priori?
No, a posteriori.
Uh-oh.
Necessary a posteriori. Does he talk about that in the first lecture? I'm not
Maybe
sure if he
I
does.
can't think of an example. I mean, he alludes to it at the very beginning, right, saying, look, all these aren't really the same thing, and it's important to know that. Right? And then he talks about the meter stick. I remember that. He talks about gold, but I think gold is the same kind of thing as the meter stick, or maybe not.
Well, a less contentious example, I mean, I don't know if he talks about this in the first lecture, but, I mean, this goes back to his theory of names and proper names being rigid designators. So I think the example that he uses in the book is that the morning star is the evening star. It's an a posteriori truth. I mean, the Egyptians thought that they were 2 different celestial objects, but we later discovered that they were the same object, Venus. Nonetheless, they used the word morning star and the word evening star as a proper name. And he wants to say that proper names given, he gives 3 arguments. I mean, people have attributed 3 arguments to him, which I guess we can go through later. That proper names have to be rigid designators, and as Bert and Alex defined earlier, a rigid designator picks up the same object in every world. So given that the name, the morning star, and the name, the evening star, pick out Venus in the actual world, and being rigid designators, they pick out Venus in every world. So that means in every world, the morning star is the evening star, which is to say it's a necessary truth, even though we discovered it through empirical investigation, namely a posteriori. So it's an example of a necessary truth that's discovered a posteriori.
Right. Okay.
Would a necessary a posteriori be the like heritage or something like that?
I'm sorry?
Doesn't he get into talking in lecture 2? He talks about Queen. Was it Queen Elizabeth II and George?
Oh, you mean about origin essentialism, right? Like that she had to have been, because we talked about that just earlier, like with respect to how Alex was talking about the branching view possibility.
But that would be a case of a necessary a posteriori.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of thinking the irrational intuition, you can't realize I'm the result of this particular conglomeration of DNA or something, or, you know, you could somehow reason a priori that these are my parents or something, or whatever. So yes, I mean, I suppose there would be another example of a necessary a posteriori truth,
Right.
according to Kripke. And that's sort of what's both, I guess, groundbreaking and scandalous about Kripke, in that, you know, it was philosophical dogma for a long time that, like we were talking about earlier, whatever is necessary has to be known a priori, whatever's a priori is necessary, whatever is contingent has to be known a posteriori, and what's known a posteriori has to be contingent. And he tries to show, and people take him to succeed in this, he shows ways in which they are, in fact, able to be uncoupled from each other.
So I've got a really stupid basic question, if I
Wait.
can ask it now. Oh no, go ahead, go.
Yeah, let me hit on the. I wanted to bring. We talked about the yardstick, or the meter stick, and I just wanted to mention one more thing about it. That was a good example of
I
the.
love that example.
The epistemological status versus the metaphysical status. I thought, where he talks about that someone who fixes the referent of a meter stick, that is that it's a definition that is a rigid designator, but then he says that the metaphysical status will be a contingent statement, provided that he talks about the water cooling and changing the length of it, that there are contingent a priori truths regarding the meter stick. So there's a difference there between the metaphysical status and the epistemological status, which I thought was was useful. That was on 57.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, it just, I think, ties in with what he's saying, that those are two different distinctions, you know, necessary / contingent versus a priori / a posteriori. So he's showing ways again,
Right,
where they are in fact distinct. The epistemological status, which in this case is a priori, is distinct from the metaphysical status, which in this case is surprisingly contingent.
Yeah, and it seems like that's where there's a lot of confusion. I mean, that was that was a little bit of my play with the when I posted the intro about the Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare. I actually had another post about God, that that there are the epistemological, like that we designate something, or we name something similar to the fixing the referent of the yardstick, but then you have metaphysical contingencies that may be different, that you don't want to then say that you're not referring, right? So I'm sorry, Helena, I had cut you off. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to remember what it was I was going to say or ask. I think it was, you know, it's one of these really basic sort of like, what's the point of this kind of type of questions. Like, it seems pretty obvious to me immediately that there'd be uses for categorizing things as necessary or not. But I don't really see why it all matters that much, whether something is categorized as a priori or not, or even as analytic or not. So what does it gain us? What value does it give to us to have these other two categories?
Did you want to go Hypatia? I mean, I could take a stab at it, but I'll probably get it wrong.
Well, I'd love to hear. I'd really love to hear. I'm being totally sincere
I think
about
one
this.
way to think about what Kripke is doing is to try to overcome a kind of fear of relativism that was emerging in philosophy of science in the period up to him, because there's people like Quine and Thomas Kuhn had sort of raised the issue that I think even in the case of two dogmas, this is very clear, this idea that there isn't really a principal distinction between a change in meaning and a change in theory. when you're dealing with something like a notion like mass across Newtonian and Einsteinian paradigm, right? So if in fact the Einstein is just sort of changing the subject, it's not really clear that he and Newton actually disagree over mass. But if that's the case, then it's not really clear that the theory of relativity represents some kind of progress over Newtonian mechanics, right? And so that makes the shift from a Newtonian paradigm to an Einsteinian one not necessarily a rational one. And so I think people thought, well, this is sort of endangers the entire scientific enterprise because it just sort of raises the specter of a kind of skepticism that there isn't really a progressive nature to the sciences, and there aren't really rational criteria from switching to one paradigm to another. And so by restoring, well, Kripke's attempt at least to try to restore a kind of metaphysics of essence to things allows there to be continuity in discussions about natural kinds across different paradigms, and then that was thought to be able to make it possible for there to be rational criteria to prefer one paradigm to another, and that was thought to make it the case that science was actually a progressive enterprise. So I think that's one of the motivations that's underlying what Kripke is doing.
Yeah, to use the example you gave with mass, what Kripke would do there is that he would treat mass like a rigid, again being a natural kind term, and he gives an argument, I think, to the extent that you would treat natural kind terms like mass, water, electricity, heat, and so forth as rigid designators. So, by the time of Newton or so, they had this particular idea of mass, and then post-Einstein, we say very different things about mass, but nonetheless, both Newton and Einstein were successfully referring to mass in a similar way as to how, again, you and I could have very different ideas about, say, who Aristotle is, but nonetheless we can both successfully refer to Aristotle, like the example that Alex gave before he left, which was that imagine if Aristotle never had studied under Plato, or never had been the teacher of Alexander, nonetheless we would still say that by Aristotle we're still picking out this individual. Likewise, we can change some of our ideas of what mass consists in, but nonetheless we will still be successfully referring to the same sort of property in some sense, that we're picking something out when we use the word mass, in the same way that even if some of these descriptions, or maybe even most of these descriptions, fail with respect to Aristotle, we can still successfully use the word Aristotle to refer to the same person in the world. So I think that's what Jack was partly getting at when he was talking about the continuity between, again, meaning change versus theory change. Because if you understood meaning to be in terms of descriptions, then you would have to say, I think that is partly what Jack is getting at, that there is maybe this tension of how you contrast meaning change from theory change. Because I don't think Kripke would say there was meaning change. There was definitely theory change, but to say that there was meaning change is a separate matter.
Yeah, it's like his example, the water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Well, I guess it's like the yardstick, that that there are contingent a priori truths. And it kind of, like Jack was saying, battles that relativistic quality that might have emerged after Quine, just because everything had been so upended, essentially, right?
Yeah. To get back at Helena's question, though, as to why there's this distinction, I guess, between a priori and a posteriori.
What is the advantage of having it and classifying things according to it?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know how. I think the distinction goes back to at least Avicenna, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that. I mean, in terms of where analytics inherited, it goes back to at least Kant, but I think the distinction is much older than it goes back to at least Avicenna. There's one sort of pithy, maybe not entirely satisfactory answer, which is one that there is a distinction. So it's useful to have a name for that distinction, but namely in how we come to acquire knowledge of certain things. We can acquire it either, I know we discussed this before, but they want to say we acquire it independent of experience, and that has to be cashed out in some way. Versus, like for example, how we come to know that bachelors are unmarried, or how 2 + 2 = 4. I don't have to investigate the world in any detail or anything like that to come to know those truths are true. Versus something that is known through the lens of experience, through particular experiences, and so forth. You know, that it's raining outside, or universal gravitation is true, or something or another. Those sorts of things, presumably, I have to actually engage with the world in some meaningful fashion. I can't just sort of obtain that from the armchair or whatever. So I think that's, I don't know if I would say that's the advantage, but it's just that there is a distinction in terms of how we come to acquire knowledge of certain truths, and the a priori, a posteriori distinction is just giving a name to it, I suppose. Now, how that becomes important in philosophy is a topic in and of itself that's going to take us, I think, far afield of this. I'll just give maybe one short stab at it, which is that, historically, certainly pre-Kripke, people conceived of philosophy as an entirely a priori enterprise, which is to say that with philosophy, they thought that if we were going to do things like metaphysics or epistemology or whatever at all, again, the idea is that since we do philosophy from the armchair, it's something that would have to, in some sense, stand independent of experience of the world. So the only way we could really do philosophy and come to truths like, everything has an explanation, like the principle of sufficient reason, or, truths about mereology or other sorts of things, those have to be done in an a priori fashion. We have to be able to use our faculties of rational insight or whatever to engage in philosophy in the first place. And this idea of the a posteriori would be confined to something like the sciences or whatever. But philosophy is conceived of as an a priori discipline. So I would say that, at least in the history of philosophy, that's where that distinction comes into play in terms of how people conceive of the project of philosophy in the first place. There's lots of other things you can say with respect to that, but I'm not sure how much in depth we'd want to go into that.
Well, that helps a lot, yeah. Both of those points.
Yeah, did we want to go into that, or where do we want to go from here? He ends up, I think, towards the end of this, until he gets to the cluster of properties argument that he ends up laying out. He pretty much stays kind of on this thread. It kind of gets to be one note over and over and over again.
Well, I think we covered the thing about transworld identity, right? With the whole Nixon and so forth. I think.
Yeah.
That's I suppose it's pretty much been taken care of. Now I don't know if, like, before you get into the cluster theory. Well, I guess it would probably be better to do it after you get into the cluster theory. Just to briefly, just to cap off maybe towards the end, is just briefly give the arguments he gives against the cluster theory or other related descriptivist theories. He gives 3 arguments that people attribute to him: the epistemic, semantic, and a modal argument as to why descriptivist theories of names and so forth can't possibly be right. So I don't know if you think it would be better to go into that now or maybe after.
Well, you're talking about the portion. There's the portion right before he gets to the cluster theory where he talks about Frege and Russell. He has a comment on Searle. You're talking about that section? Where he's
what page is that on?
So in 58 he talks.
Does it look boyish on me?
Do you want to invite realistic nihilist?
Sure, if he wants to.
I think he was looking to come in. Let me just give him a link.
I'd like to talk real quick about what he says. I think he says Frege, maybe not, but that there's two meanings of sense, two senses of sense that have gone sort of unnoticed. And I think from there is where he leads into, why the cluster theory just can't be what we really mean to be doing. And I would love for someone to tease that out a little bit more, because that was not too hard.
I think I know what you're talking about. He's talking about sense as determining the reference or fixing the reference. You could use
right, and that it's a mistake to
fix references versus the meaning of the term. And Kripke, I think, gives examples over and over how fixing the reference is distinct from meaning, or even figuring into the truth conditions of that word.
That to me was really important. And made a huge
perfect example. We just talked about something like that just earlier, right? With the meter stick.
Yeah.
A stick of such and such like meter is, such and such length long as the stick, right? So we could say that the stick, in some sense, fixes the reference of the word meter in that case. So assuming we're using the word in the same way across possible situations, meter just refers to such and such length that's been fixed by this particular stick. But obviously that doesn't go, the stick doesn't figure into the meaning of the word meter, or into the truth conditions of the word meter, because we can obviously use the word meter in worlds where that stick doesn't exist, or it's of a completely different length instead. So there's a distinction between how one fixes the reference of a particular name or word versus what the meaning or the truth conditions of that name or word is. Another example of this would be, we used the example with the man in the red cap in the pub that Alex and I were using. So you go to a pub, you see a guy in maybe in some shadowy corner of the pub, he's got a red cap on. So you might say, well, that guy with the red cap needs another drink or something, whatever, right? Now, when you're picking out that person by that description, man with the red cap man with the red cap, you're using that description to hone in on an individual in the actual world. But we wouldn't say that that description somehow figures into the meaning of, say, the name of whoever that person is. So we might say that let Bob designate the man with the red cap on in the pub, we wouldn't say that part of the meaning of the name Bob is man with the red cap on. We've just merely fixed the reference of Bob with man with the red cap on. But that neither figures into the meaning of Bob, nor does it figure into the truth conditions of Bob, because presumably we can still be talking about Bob in worlds where he doesn't have the red cap on, or if he takes the cap on later off tonight, he's not going to suddenly stop being Bob, and we're not going to stop being able to successfully refer to him as Bob. So there's a distinction between the meaning or truth conditions of a name on the one hand versus fixing the reference, say, through a sense or a description on the other.
Does that make sense, Helena?
Yes, very much so. And then he goes from there to say, well, it looks like also there's been some attempts to kind of fix that problem, right? And he's saying, well, one of them is sort of just saying, well, names are sort of abbreviations. Right? And that's how he then moves on to really criticize this idea of these clusters of properties.
Yeah, let me read this. He has this one section where he criticizes Searle. He says that Searle says, to put the same point differently, suppose we ask, why do we have proper names at all? Obviously to refer to individuals. Yes, but descriptions could do that for us, but only at the cost of specifying identity conditions every time the reference is made. So he's basically saying the name's a shortcut for the reference. And then Kripke's response is that such a suggestion, if necessary, is used in the way I've been using it in this lecture, must clearly be false. unless he's got some very interesting essential property commonly attributed to Aristotle. Most of the things commonly attributed to Aristotle are things that Aristotle might not have done at all. In a situation in which he didn't do them, we would describe that as a situation in which Aristotle didn't do them. I think essentially pointing out Searle's problem there of that Searle would have to abandon that was Aristotle at all, if it is simply that the name is a that the name simply has a description associated with it. If the description fails, then what do you do, right?
Yeah, that's his that's well, I mean, it sounds like that's his modal argument against descriptivism, right. Which is that if you thought the meaning of the name was some set of description, then in every world where that name refers, that person or that entity satisfies those descriptions. So if you said part of the meaning of the name Aristotle was a teacher of Alexander, then that means in every possible world in which Aristotle exists, Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander, which is to say being the teacher of Alexander is a necessary or an essential property of Aristotle, which presumably we would reject, right? So that would be that's basically his modal argument against descriptivism.
Right. So then from there he goes on to me really pinpoint those three things, which I would love it if you wouldn't mind, somebody who knows better than me, to sort of summarize what they are. So that starts, I guess, on page 64-ish.
Wait, you're talking about the three prior?
Yes.
The prior theories problems. That's what you're referring to.
Are you talking about the arguments against the descriptivism, or are you referring to the? Like I think he describes descriptivism in that section or something. Like he gives us certain theses.
I think he's describing it. I've got to find it again.
Are you talking about this, Helena? Are you talking about his actual argument?
What do you mean by this?
Oh, sorry.
I think Bert is. Oh wait, no. Yeah, he's screen sharing now.
Right, I can't see it, but it seemed to me. Yeah, I can't see it. It seemed to me that after he criticized Searle, then he went into and sort of really pinpointed sort of what's wrong with the thinking that names are just either abbreviations for clusters of properties, or and he had, if I recall, sort of.
He lays out the six conditions, right? The six premises. Are you talking about that?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, to every name or designating expression X, there corresponds a cluster of properties, namely the properties.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's right. I think wasn't he sort of describing what a cluster theory would be like?
Yeah, you guys, hold on. Let me try that one more time because I have it up. Are you guys not able to read that? Is the text too crappy that you can't actually read that?
No, now we can see it. It's just that when you were presenting earlier, for some reason you weren't showing up, but we can see it.
So those are the six premises and then he had one condition down at the bottom that I pulled out. Right, that's what you're talking about, right, Helena?
Could be.
Okay. I don't have to present, but maybe I'll just step through it first. He says that for every designating expression, there corresponds a cluster of properties, and then he says one of the properties, or some conjointly, are believed to be by A to be picked out by some individual uniquely. Pick out some individual uniquely. So A, essentially, the first premise, there's a set of properties such that A believes there's an phi x. One of the properties is believed by X to be unique to the individual. So it says in premise 3, it says if most or a weighted most of them are satisfied by one unique object, then Y is the referent of X. So he's basically saying that if you have this cluster of properties and enough of them satisfy the thing, then you are successfully referring, right? he says if the vote yields no unique object, X does not refer. If the statement if X exists and X has most of the properties known a priori by the speaker. Oh, if X exists, then X has most of the properties known, and then has most of the. If X exists, then X has most of the properties expressed as a necessary. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. The statement if X exists and X has most of phi's expresses. Did I lop off a portion? Anyway.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's the same thing in the book.
Yeah, I just don't know. I just don't know how to read.
That's the same thing in the book.
I think of phi as, cluster properties or
the property.
all the cluster properties, or one or two of a cluster. Mm. That's kind of how.
Yeah, phi is just picking up the properties.
Yeah. Either,
right, and then
particular properties or a whole cluster of them is what I say.
And X is just an individual.
X is just the name, right? It's the designator? Or is it the...
Well, I guess here it would be the... It's the... he defines it in one. It's just the name.
X is the name, and then Y would be the referent, and whether or not there is one given by this cluster. Right? To me, this is pointing out how this is a bad way to think about it.
Right.
So he's saying the name X, which has some cluster properties phi, such that A believes that phi X, which is that X is some phi or something or whatever. And then, given the descriptivist theory, like he lays out in 3, if it has most of those, again, this is a cluster of descriptions theory, right? So like Searle talks about, there's this whole cluster of descriptions associated with Aristotle, student of Plato, teacher of Alexander, I don't know, writer of the Neomachian Ethics or something or whatever, right? You'd have all of these descriptions. If most of them are satisfied by some individual in the world, then that individual is what the referent of the name Aristotle is referring to.
So why is it known a priori by the speaker? That was the part that I got tripped up on.
Because it's a theory of meaning. So if the speaker is actually using the name Aristotle competently, then presumably they know what the meaning of Aristotle is. If they and that would again require knowing what cluster of descriptions is associated with Aristotle. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using the name. They wouldn't be by Aristotle. They wouldn't mean Aristotle. They would be referring to something else entirely.
Right.
Given a descriptivist theory. Now, the fact that that's unusual in and of itself is part of one of another argument, his epistemological argument against descriptivism. Because presumably we don't think that we know a priori that Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander, the writer of the the metaphysics, the student of Plato, so on and so forth. Because you'd have to say that a speaker who used the name Aristotle but did not either attribute those things to or did not think those things were true of Aristotle was not actually a competent speaker, that they were not in grasp of the name Aristotle and its meaning. But at this stage, he's like, by the end of this lecture, he gives hints of these arguments throughout the first lecture, like especially about the modal argument. But at this point in the lecture, he's just laying out what he's going to attack in the next 2 lectures.
Right, it ends, I guess it ends not too far after this, right? I made the mistake of drinking a lot of wine when I read these last 9 pages, and I barely remember them. I was like, oh shit, that was a bad idea. I still had 9 to go last night because I hadn't actually read to the end. So did we want? He gets into his cluster theory in chapter 2, right?
He recapitulates it again, because I mean these were actual lectures, and the amazing thing is he gave all of this without any notes. Like this was all just sort of, you know, him freestyling, I guess you could say.
And what's funny about that is that he has these examples that he leaves dangling. Like there'll be this. There were so many paragraphs where I get to the end and I'm like, wait, was that the point? But he just moves to a different example. It's like he, you know, thought of something better to use as an example or whatever.
It really does read like he's talking. It's pretty cool. Yeah. So maybe we talk about what we think of this. Is this a better way to think of names than clusters of descriptions?
Well, that project's I think a little bit incomplete in insofar as like what Kripke's Kripke is just sort of like if we're looking at the first lecture, what Kripke has basically just done in the first lecture, if we think about it, is that he's laid out this distinction, you know, between the a priori, the necessary, and the analytic. He doesn't talk about the analytic as much, but you know, just that's there. He wants to say that we can clearly these are distinct ideas. It's not a trivial project to show that they are in fact one and the same. He goes on then to, in relation to that, talk about, you know, his theory of necessity de re versus de dicto, where de re necessity is a sort of more suspicious type of necessity that Quine attacked. But he wants to say that no, you know, we have a perfectly intuitive understanding of it because, you know, we could say, well, Nixon could have lost the election, right? We're attributing something to Nixon. We're not just talking about some type of description or whatever. And this is where he introduces, in relation to that, his famous theory of rigid designation and whatnot. And then, sort of after that, he talks about some of the problems associated with a description theory of names instead, where instead of looking at, I mean, I don't know if we would want to talk about the causal theory of reference, but where a descriptivist would want to use a certain set of descriptions to pick out the name, he points out modal problems with it that we got into. And then sort of after that, after he gets into this whole bit about transworld identity, and he makes these more interesting moves about how to distinguish necessary / contingent from a priori / a posteriori, given that he gives an example of a contingent a priori truth. He then goes on into the cluster theory of names and lays it out. So what he's really doing here is just mostly stage setting, I think. Like he's introducing critical concepts and certain distinctions that's going to become important in the next two lectures. But I don't think in the first lecture itself he really gives like in detail why he thinks the cluster theory of names is clearly mistaken. And I don't think here he develops his positive theory of names yet. That comes on in the later lectures, I believe, it might be lecture 3 or something, where he basically lays out the causal theory of reference.
Yeah. This to me seemed like a very much in line with what we've been chatting about, but it seems like he's the beef of where he's going. Especially, I'm somewhat curious to see what he has to say about philosophy of mind in lecture 3. I read lecture 2, but it still feels like it's set up for something that he still has yet still wants to say. Although I guess the cluster theory has obviously has merit to it, but the entire time it's a little bit like what Helena is saying in terms of where's he going with this. And it is amazing that he gave these 3 lectures within like a week of each other or something. When I checked the dates, it was like the 20th, the 23rd, and the 27th of January or something like that.
Right. And again, he did all of this without any notes. He just came and he started lecturing. So yeah, I mean, as far as what we think about this, maybe one thing to do to sort of help wrap this up is just to give maybe like a sneak peek at how he attacks the cluster theory of descriptions. I mean, you know, obviously people would have to go on to read the next 2 lectures to see that in detail. But you know, given that you laid them out, you know, the six conditions, they were on page, like in the 60s or so. Like the first one was about.
Starts at 64.
Right. So yeah, I mean, he lays out these conditions, at every name there's a cluster of properties, etc., etc. One of the properties are conjointly believed by A to pick out some individual uniquely. If most of them are satisfied by some unique object, then that object is the referent of the name. If the doesn't yield a given unique object, then the name doesn't refer, and that the cluster of properties associated with the name is both a necessary truth and a priori, given that, again, I mean, he also, I think, in the second lecture, expands on these in detail as to why the descriptivist is committed to these to what he sets out here. But given these commitments, I think I can just sort of briefly lay out the basic idea of like what's problematic with this theory. And there's basically three arguments that he gives that people have attributed to him: an epistemic argument, a modal argument, and a semantic argument, which are all very closely related. So I mean, given the sixth thesis, which is just that the statement, if X exists, then X has most of the phi's, expresses a necessary truth, the modal argument is just to flatly deny that, because you'd have to say something like, Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander, or whatever, is a necessary truth. That is to say, in every world in which Aristotle exists, then Aristotle is a teacher of Alexander. But couldn't we imagine, or couldn't it have been the case that Aristotle could have failed to have been a philosopher and never taught Alexander? Or that Aristotle had, I don't know, died of cholera or something when he was a child, and most of the descriptions associated with him would have been false, or whatever. So the claim that Aristotle is the teacher of Alexander, or whatever given set of descriptions you want to associate with him being a necessary truth, Kripke would want to say that that's false. But given that the descriptivist theory of names requires that to be a necessary truth, then the descriptivist theory of names is false. That's the basic idea behind the modal argument, which is to simply say that the descriptivist theory of names requires that these statements of the form X has these given properties, where the properties are what are the descriptions that figure into the meaning of the name, but that's just false. So that's the modal argument. The semantic argument we talked about, just briefly before, which was just that a speaker who's using the name Aristotle wouldn't be a competent speaker if they hadn't associated these descriptions with the name Aristotle. So when I use the name Aristotle competently, I'm thinking of an individual who's, the teacher of Alexander, the writer of the Metaphysics, the student of Plato, so on and so forth. And what Kripke wants to get at is that you can use the name Aristotle competently without knowing any of many or if any of the descriptions associated with the name Aristotle. I mean, to give a more innocuous example, like let's say you're talking with a friend, and your friend says, well, Bob's an engineer or something or whatever, right? Now, is an engineer presumably is not enough to uniquely pick out some object in the world, so we don't have some cluster of descriptions that we can use to pick out Bob, like in the world, specifically Bob and not somebody else. But nonetheless, we would say that in that conversation, and also when I'm using the name Bob, I'm using it to pick out the same individual that my friend is using to pick out by the name Bob, right? But it's not as though I have access to this set of descriptions that the descriptivist wants to say uniquely refers to Bob in the actual world. So given that I can use a name competently without being associated, without knowing or being associated with this cluster of descriptions that presumably uniquely refers to Bob, then the descriptivist theory makes a false prediction that one can only competently use the name if one is in fact acquainted with most of the descriptions that pick out the referent of the name, and he wants to say that that's simply false. And he gives an example involving Gödel and Schmidt, which people can Google, that gets into that. But that's basically the core idea of the semantic argument. And finally, the epistemic argument, which is attacking this premise or this thesis 5 that the statement if X exists and X has most of the phi's is known a priori by the speaker. Well, he just wants to say, well, that's just obviously false, right? Which is that we can talk about Aristotle truly and not know most, if any, of the descriptions associated with him, right? It's not as though just by attending to the name Aristotle and using the name Aristotle as referring to that individual in the world, that we could come to know a priori that he's a teacher of Alexander, or that he is a writer of the metaphysics, or that he's a student of Plato, so on and so forth. The descriptivist requires that that type of statement is an a priori truth. Kripke argues that, well, clearly it's not an a priori truth. So again, the descriptivist theory makes another false prediction, which is that it requires that these sorts of statements be a priori truths, which Kripke says that we have to reject. So just to run through them again, the modal argument was that the descriptivist theory of names requires that certain kinds of statements of the form X has most of the phi's are necessary truths, which Kripke says is false. The semantic argument requires that a competent speaker can only use the proper name competently if they are acquainted with most of the descriptions that pick out that name uniquely, which again Kripke wants to say is false. And the epistemic argument is that statements of the form that the name has, the referent of the name, has most of these given properties that has to be known a priori by the speaker. Again, that's false. So those are the three problems that Kripke develops, I think, in the second and third lecture. That's sort of a hangout in and of itself, but that's, hopefully that gives a bit of a taste for why Kripke thinks you have to reject the descriptivist theory of names.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Is that characterization, the very last one, really true of descriptivists, that they would have to hold that that we would know those things a priori?
He explains it, I think, in the second lecture as to why that's true. I give just a way to sort of get a feel for it, which is just that the descriptive theory of names is a theory of the meaning of the name. The meaning of the name is given by a certain cluster of descriptions. So right. you couldn't actually be using the name as that name, as with respect to what that name means, unless you were actually acquainted with those descriptions, because otherwise you would be talking about something completely different, right? You might mean something by Aristotle, you might mean your computer or something, but presumably that's not what we're talking about when we're using the name Aristotle. So to preserve the meaning, per the descriptivist theory of names, you have to actually know the descriptions associated with it. But again, Kripke lays out in more detail than I have, certainly, and he wants to argue that that's false. You can use we can know that we can use that name as that name, even though we don't know a priori, X, Y, Z about that name. But again, all of that is just a completely negative thesis or argument. That's just attacking descriptivism. He goes later on to give his own positive theory as to what names have to consist in. Well, actually, he doesn't call it a theory. There's a sort of there's a funny note in the book where he says that he wants to avoid giving a theory of something because theories tend to be wrong, whatever. But Kripke's view has basically developed into a theory.
Hypatia, I haven't read lecture 3, but how does he move from this? I'm assuming it has to do with identity. How does he move to talk about? He talks about dualism in part 3, right?
That's at the very end of part. That's basically part 3. Yes. Lecture 3, at any rate.
How does he are you familiar enough to briefly summarize how he gets to that point?
Yeah, but I'm not sure how comprehensible it would be if you're not familiar with some of the stuff he does in lecture 2 and whatnot, which is that, like we talked about it briefly, like how he thinks there are contingent a priori truths and necessary a posteriori truths, right? And now the idea of the necessary a posteriori is sort of what captures most people's attention as being very odd and weird, right? Because you would think a necessary truth is just something that you'd have to know a priori, right? Like when we say something like the morning star is the evening star, it's a necessary truth. course, he goes on to argue with respect to natural kind terms that heat is mean kinetic molecular motion, or water is H2O, are both necessary truths. The idea that people had before Kripke, there's another bit of context with respect to Kripke's whole project that we haven't mentioned. So, I mean, we had mentioned how Kripke is, part of the context that Kripke is responded to is a sort of descriptivist theory of names, with people like Searle and other descriptivists, and Neil, I guess. Well, actually not Neil. Other descriptivists who are sort of framing this whole debate. And then also, of course, there are people like Quine with respect to their views of modality that he's also partly responding to in this book. But another sort of dogma, or I guess you could say received view that he's attacking in this book, he attacked it previously, and then there's some precedence for how he attacks it, is this view about identity, which is that for a long time people thought that there could be contingent identities. They thought that the statement, water is H2O, was an identity claim, but it was contingently true because, water could be something else in some other possible world, right? Like, couldn't water be made of XYZ or some other substance in some possible world, right? So that it's an identity claim, but it's not a necessary truth. But Kripke and another philosopher, Ruth Barkin Marcus, they basically come up with an argument to the extent that all identities have to be necessary truths, and there's an argument for that, which requires some familiarity with logic. So just for now, just take my word for it that there's an argument following some basic theses of first order logic that all identities, at least those involving rigid designators, have to be necessary truths. Now, given that that's the case, it follows then that these identity claims like water is H2O, or the morning star is the evening star, or heat is mean kinetic molecular motion, all of those, even though they're established a posteriori, they are necessary truths. They're truths that have to be true. But nonetheless, there's still, Kripke he's not missing out on the puzzlement that people have here in that, well, it seems like we could imagine them being false, right? Like, couldn't history have turned out differently and we could have discovered that water was XYZ instead? Or that it could have turned out that the morning star and the evening star were, in fact, referring to different celestial objects? Or, that, like Clark Kent to Superman, couldn't it have turned out that Clark Kent and Superman were two completely different individuals? Kripke is sensitive to that worry. And what he builds into with his account of modality is that with these necessary a posteriori truths, one has an obligation in some sense to explain away this illusion of contingency. There is a possibility that people are tracking there when they're talking about, if Superman could have failed to have been Clark Kent or water could have failed to have been H2O, that does refer to a contingent situation. But they're confusing it with the actual situation at hand. So, for example, when I say that water is necessarily H2O and somebody imagines water could have been XYZ instead, what they're looking at is they're looking at some qualitatively similar case that's actually distinct, that they're confusing it with this situation. And the example he uses in the book is with gold and fool's gold. Fool's gold is not gold, even though it looks like gold, right? So likewise, this water that's made of XYZ looks like water. You could say like it tastes like water and so forth, but it is not in fact water in the same way that fool's gold is not gold. So what we're confusing is the appearance of something else with what that thing is to generate this illusion of contingency. So likewise, in the case of the morning star and the evening star, yes, there are distinct appearances in the morning and the evening that we're associating, and those appearances could have been associated with different objects. He's not denying that. He's just saying that given the objects that those appearances actually pick out, well, presumably that object is the same object in every possible world. So to the extent that the name picks out that object, then that name can only be referring to that object in every possible to that given object in every possible world. It couldn't have picked out distinct objects. So there's an illusion of contingency that you have to explain away, which comes down partly to an appearance reality distinction. So again, fool's gold looks like gold, but it's not actually gold. So that's why we can say it's a necessary truth that gold is composed of atoms containing 79 protons, as opposed to gold is iron pyrite, which is fool's gold instead, right? So there's an appearance-reality distinction. And the appearance-reality distinction is critical when we explain away the illusion of contingency. Now, how that relates to his argument against dualism, I'm sorry, his argument for dualism, I should say. I mean, again, I can only really give a pithy stab at it, because I mean, this makes more sense like once you've actually gone through the lectures and sort of incorporated his framework. So, what physicalists or materialists pre-Kripke were saying, like again going back to this contingent identity view, they were saying, like I think, what was it? It was JJC Smart and I think UT Place. I think it might have been UT Place. No, it might have been Smart who I think had this paper like sensations as brain processes, and UT Place had a related paper, and they were arguing that you know, feelings, mental states, and so forth, they were brain processes, that was an identity statement, but that was a contingent identity statement, right? Because again, people had thought that you could have contingent identities, like water is H2O, the morning star is the evening star, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, you know, given Ruth Bark and Marcus's argument, Kripke's arguments, they, you know, the idea is that we reject that in favor of the view that all identities involving at least rigid designators are necessary truths. So now the physicalist has to say something stronger, which is that mental states being identical to physical states is a necessary truth. But like with other necessary truths that are a posteriori, there's a duty to explain away the contingency, right? You would, and that would generally consist of appealing to some type of appearance-reality distinction. There's a gap between what appears to be the case and what is the case, presumably. Fool's gold, again, is not gold. Now, the problem in the case of identifying mental states with physical states, insofar as one explains away the illusion of contingency, is look at the gold, fool's gold case. You have something that appears to be gold, but is not actually gold. We can make sense of that, right? And that's how we can explain away this illusion of contingency. And likewise, we have something that appears to be water, but is not actually water. But in the case of something like identifying pain with something like C fibers firing, what the physicalist would have to say is there's something that appears to be pain, but is not actually pain. And what Kripke wants to say is that that appearance-reality distinction cannot apply to appearances themselves. If something appears to be pain, it is pain. You can't, like where we can say something can appear to be gold, but it's not gold, or something can appear to be the morning star, but it's not the morning star, or something can appear to be water, but it's not water. That doesn't make sense with respect to mental states themselves. You can't say something can appear to be a pain, or something can appear to be red, but not actually be a pain or be red, right? So the physicalist is unable to explain away this illusion of contingency. And then he goes on to say, then it turns out that, in fact, the statement, sensations are brain processes, or mental states are physical states, cannot, in fact, be a necessary truth, because the physicalist cannot explain away this illusion of contingency in the way we can explain away the illusion of contingency in these other cases of necessary a posteriori truths. So the physicalist cannot actually help themselves to this apparatus Kripke's constructed of how you can have necessary a posteriori truths, after all, because unlike these other cases, the physicalist cannot explain away the illusion of contingency.
With the wandering way out into the deep end for a second, would not a like something that was like a token identity theorist though say that something is a that the proper analogy is that pyrite is fool's gold and not that fool's gold is gold, right? I would say it's sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. No. That was all I had to say. I mean, somebody like Searle, like somebody. So I've been like very much into Searle lately, reading a lot of stuff, and he would claim that he's not an identity theorist, but it would seem to me even that identity theorists, which I don't buy it. I actually think he is. I think he's a token identity like he subscribes to token identity theory, but it seems to me that it's not a in the case of fool's gold and gold, it is it's a different thing altogether, right? Like you're describing the difference, but wouldn't somebody who is an identity theorist say that it is the same thing, that it swaps for one for the other?
So you mean like a case where pain is constituted by C fibers firing versus pain is constituted by ectoplasm or something? Is that the idea?
No, I would mainly think of it as like Searle talks about level of description, right? That the pyrite is even that doesn't he would somebody for like him, for instance, would say that mind the brain and the mind are the same thing, that you're not actually there's no other entity there, that there's something that he needs to account for there. I don't doubt that, or I don't dispute that. In the first person perspective or first person experience, and with same thing with C fibers and pain, right? With that you can try to describe it there, but you're missing something there. You're not accounting for something. But in the case of that you had mentioned, it seemed to me like that is the appearance versus the reality of it. I don't know. I'm a little lost in my own objection now, or not objection, but my own point.
Well, I mean, in fairness, this is something that I think you can only really understand once you've sort of inculcated what he develops throughout the book. So this is sort of like the capstone of the book. So this is after you've gone through all of the arguments and the distinctions he introduces and the ideas that he gets you to consider. But I mean, again, like this is part of his he makes this appearance reality distinction with how he again explains away this illusion of contingency with respect to necessary a posteriori truths, right? And the point is, a physicalist has to say that pain. Well, I mean, I should say one thing. Kripke is attacking type identity theory here. He's not attacking. Well, at least I think the way people read him is that he's not. His argument is only really effective against type identity theory.
Okay.
And actually, Chalmers' two-dimensional argument against materialism is in some ways a refinement of Kripke's original argument against dualism, but it's a more generalized argument. But it has a similar core to it. But I think most people, or at least I should say Chalmers reads Kripke as offering an argument principally against type identity theory. So I'm not sure if Kripke would dispute that a token identity theorist might escape the net of the argument, but nonetheless, there's going to be a very, 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 very similar argument in the wings that can be offered against token identity theory anyway.
Right.
But I mean, again, just the idea is that if you're using the appearance reality distinction to explain away the seeming contingency of water equaling H2O or other cases of necessary a posteriori truths, Kripke wants to say you cannot make that move with respect to appearances themselves. You cannot say something appears to be pain, but it's not a pain. In the way something can appear to be water, but not be water.
Right. I think it would seem to me that Searle would take issue with that as well, because I think he takes issue with other philosophers on that same front in terms of not saying that it's not the thing, right? That the appearance is not the thing itself, but that it is something else is going on there. But sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not denying that Kripke is making certain. I mean, his argument certainly requires some taking on some theses that you might disagree about. So I mean, if you disagree with, like, I mean, if you don't think that identities have to be necessary, for example, then obviously that's one way out of the argument, right? It's just that, again, post Mark and Marcus and post Kripke, most people think identities have to be necessary, at least those involving rigid designators. They have to be necessary truths. So when the physicalist says that pain is C fibers firing, that has to be true not just in this world, but in every world. It has to be the case that pain is C fibers firing.
Yeah, and I wasn't. And just to clarify, I wasn't. I wouldn't be I wouldn't. I wouldn't even know whether I would agree with the view or not. So I'm certainly not objecting to what he might put forward. I could entirely find it.
What's the causal theory of reference cover? Because I think that might be useful.
Well, we only really went through lecture 1, which is just. I mean, I guess you could say it's mostly stage setting by Kripke. Kripke goes into that in the later lectures, so we haven't gone into that in detail. Alex talked about it a little bit with respect to like initial baptisms and other sorts of things, but even again, we're not getting into like Kripke's. I mean, in fairness, we haven't really gotten into Kripke's like detailed case against descriptivism. Even I've only just given a very pithy summary of it. With the semantic, modal, and epistemic argument.
We've only been through his objections, actually, I think, for the most part.
Right. Yeah. And that's basically what lecture 1 just is. Just says, well, here are some things that people have believed that, it's not clear that we should believe them. Here are some problems with it. And here's what the view I'm going to be attacking in the next 2 lectures is. That's basically what he accomplishes in lecture 1. That's it.
Yeah, we plucked these for the record. We plucked this portion out because it made sense after the Frege, Russell, and Quine hangouts to do something along these lines. But it seemed like a good trajectory. Did anybody else want to offer anything? It's coming up on 3 hours. We should probably end the hangout soon. But I wanted to see if there's any. I know Realistic Nihilist had joined us, and Hal, if you guys had anything you wanted to offer.
I had something I wanted to offer, but I don't know if it's pertinent.
I think we should also talk about why Kripke is wrong about everything.
That's a separate hangout.
Maybe you want to do a hangout about that, because this has been one of the most damaging. Naming a necessity has done so much damage to philosophy. I can't even begin to tell you. So,
yeah, there's a good Scott Soames lecture that I think will make a lot more sense to me now. But he tore into it quite a bit. It seemed like.
No, he's the biggest Kripke worshipper of all time.
No, he's talking about Soames' attack on Kripke's argument for dualism.
Right.
Oh, okay.
But what Jack is getting at there has a significant kernel of truth behind it. That Soames is basically a Kripke, like he's the Kripke fanboy.
Yeah, the number one.
The number one. Like he actually wrote a really good history of analytic philosophy, a 2-volume set, but you can see it's very biased because he starts with I think like Moore. And he ends with Kripke, and Kripke is like the capstone of everything that happened in analytic philosophy.
It's all leading up to. It's
the hero of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's what's called Whig history. That history is sort of progress leading up to where we are now. So
there was a paper about that because the guy who did the NDPR of Soames' book had a really negative review of Soames' book, given how problematic Soames' history was. And he did a follow-up paper on that exact issue where he brought up this idea of Whig history.
Oh, did he? Oh, isn't that funny?
Yeah. It was but yeah, I mean, as far as Kripke being wrong, that would be, I think, a hangout in and of itself, like if you think that.
Well, I mean, I think that the argument that Kripke, the causal theory of reference, can't solve Frege puzzles is probably not a very complicated argument. It wouldn't take very long to lay out.
Did you cover Frege puzzles in your sense and reference hangout?
I don't believe so.
Oh, really? That's surprising, because that's sort of what the reason why Frege
Well,
introduced
we tried.
census.
Yeah, we tried to get. We were trying to get to Russell's
Theory
theory
of descriptions.
descriptions.
I see.
Yeah, so it ended up being a hangout that probably should have been 3 hangouts, and as a result, it was actually a mess. Like it was good, but it was a lot less organized than the Quine hangout, which was a lot more bite size. So.
Right.
So what we could do is I wouldn't be opposed to having like a separate. Sorry, we're getting your TV, Jack. Sorry. I wouldn't be opposed to doing another hangout, like a addendum or a side hangout to talk about. I'd be very much curious to hear the objections, and it sounds like you guys have some things you guys want to say, but maybe it's too late in this hangout to get to them. But I'm definitely interested, so maybe we could do a hangout in. I have a pretty busy week coming up, but maybe in a week or two we could do a follow-up hangout, and I could grab Jack and Realistic Nihilist and a couple of you other guys. We could have a chat about it. Would you guys be up for that?
Yeah, but what did Josh want to bring up? Because I cut him off.
Well, I was thinking that Kripke's criticism about the appearances could be equally applied to what he claims is the distinction between the appearance and the actuality of something like fool's gold and something like that.
Did you want to try to squeeze it in, since it's relevant to what we were talking about?
Well, I thought that it depends on his. It does depend on his theory of reference, right? It depends on the causal theory of reference. But I was thinking to someone for whom gold simply is an appearance, there isn't going to be a distinction between fool's gold and gold, right? Unless, like a certain set of appearances, because obviously there are going to be different. There are going to be different phenomenal facts about gold and fool's gold. But for someone who doesn't make those distinctions, right, if it's just some sort of shiny object that reflects a certain wavelength of light or something, there's not going to be a distinction for that person.
You're talking about like a pragmatist or something like that type of notion.
No, it just has to do with an internalist theory of reference, which is, I think, what Kripke resists. So for a person who's using an idiolect of gold, there's not going to be a fact of the matter about whether pyrite is gold or gold is gold. They're going to be the same on that view of reference, right? Which is what Kripke resists in the causal theory of reference.
It's not unlike the gravity example, right? Like with Newton's use of gravity, or pre Einsteinian use of gravity.
Yeah, I think what Realistic Nihilist is getting at with that is just the like Kripke's positive story about this appearance-reality gap is dependent on both a semantic externalism, which is this theory of meaning, that meaning isn't wholly constituted, by the internal states of the speaker, and also just, again, very closely tied to this causal theory of reference. And if you can test that, obviously you can cast some doubt on some of the things he says about like how it looks like gold, but it's not really gold. Then it gets into a question of what counts as being really gold, or whatever. Why should we privilege it being made of, say, 79 protons as opposed to, say, some other set of properties, like like it's a yellowish shiny object or something or another. So I mean that's sort of some of the territory. I think you can get into that. But what I thought, I don't know if this would be a problem. What I thought might be useful is, I think I laid out very briefly Kripke's attack on descriptivism. I think Alex did a good job of laying out, in brief, Kripke's causal theory of reference, and we even laid out in brief Kripke's argument against dualism. I'm sorry, for dualism. But what I thought might be fruitful to do, like before we close the hangout, because I mean, again, like one of the issues of lecture one is just mostly stage setting. But so for just some ideas for people to chew on and look into later is what were or what are some of the perceived problems with Kripke's view, because Kripke actually writes a paper, I think a puzzle about belief, where he gives an argument against his own view later on as to here are certain problems Kripke is solving, right, with the causal theory of reference, like that gets around the semantic, epistemic, and modal problems, right? But there are other problems with the causal theory of reference inherits that's still an active area of philosophical research. And I thought it might be, I don't know if you think it would be interesting to maybe, just in brief, lay out what some people think those issues are.
Sure, that sounds fine.
Right, so well, again, like I said, like I think what we've basically shown is like this is what Kripke is essentially doing. What Kripke is doing is he sees himself as, or rather what this book really does, as Alex was getting into it, really what people take it to be doing is that it brings about, it makes metaphysics respectable again by incorporating, these views of both modal metaphysics and philosophy of language, right? Where we can, we can make sense of derived modality. We want to move from a descriptivist slash, Fregean slash Russellian theory of names to a causal theory of reference, or historically what might have been called like a million theory of names. So I mean, in the history of philosophy of language, Fregean theories were basically descriptivist theories, and the idea of it is that names not only denote objects in the world, but they also connote, in the sense that there's something like a set of descriptions, or what Frege calls a sense that governs the name, as being part of what figures into the meaning of a name, in some sense. By contrast, the theory that Kripke is moving towards is a million theory of names, where names do not connote, they merely denote. Like, there's no requirement that a name have a given sense or descriptions associated with it, given after all that Kripke attacks, any such requirement. So all there is to a name for a million like Kripke, or for someone who adopts the causal theory of reference, just is the referent. The meaning of the name Aristotle just is that object in the world, Aristotle. So that's why the thought is, a million thinks that names do not connote, they merely denote. And historically there have been, I think, like 3 or 4 problems that have put some tension on a million theory, one of which I think Kripke even develops in a later paper. So the first problem is about negative existentials, right? So you guys covered, I think, in your sense and reference hangout on how Russell solves the problem of negative existentials, right, with descriptive with definite descriptions, right? So now, if you have a million theory of names where the meaning of a name is exhausted by its referent, what the object actually picks out in the world, then how are you going to make sense of negative existentials like Socrates doesn't exist, which could be a meaningful statement, or even more so, Hamlet doesn't exist, right? Hamlet presumably doesn't pick out an object in the world, so there's nothing associated with the name Hamlet to actually give it meaning, but nonetheless we would say that the sentence Hamlet doesn't exist is a meaningful sentence, right? That's a true negative existential statement. So the million is, has some work to do as far as to how to cash out analyzing negative existentials, because they've dropped this whole nice framework of definite descriptions that Russell developed to address that problem in the first place. So they're sort of back where they started in some sense, because they're dropping this Russellian picture that was partly motivated to address some of those issues in the first place. That's one issue. That's the issue of about negative existentials, as far as both meaning and proper use is concerned. Another.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I'll wait till you're done.
Basically, just to clarify, when you're saying million, you're talking about John Stuart Mill million.
Yes, I'm sorry,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, J.S. Mill. He basically had a view very similar to Kripke's on names. The view, again, is that names do not connote, they denote. The meaning of the name is just exhausted by its referent in the world. So the meaning of the word Aristotle is not some set of descriptions or senses or connotations associated with the name Aristotle. It's just that object that we're picking up by the name Aristotle. You know, that person or something. So the meaning is exhausted by the referent. So anyway, that was one issue, which is this issue of negative existentials. Now, another problem, in addition with that, has to do with what Jack was referring to with respect to Frege puzzles, which Frege, developed this sense reference distinction probably to solve. So take the standard example.
And I was just thinking that maybe that Bert would want to do a hangout on a puzzle about belief. Because
well, I think he was saying he was going to go into Wittgenstein and Moore and Wittgenstein in the following.
Oh, okay. All right.
But anyway, the other issue with respect to names on a million theory of names would have to be the case that, given Frege puzzles, the thought is that a million theory of names, given that they drop senses figuring into the meaning of the name, they can't actually solve Frege puzzles. A Frege puzzle would be a case like Lois Lane believes that Superman is vulnerable to kryptonite. But it doesn't follow, even though Clark Kent is Superman, that she would believe that Clark Kent is vulnerable to kryptonite, right? Now, so the puzzle is supposed to be, how is it the case that the names Superman and Clark Kent have the same referent, but there can be two different true statements with respect to them, that their names have, that these names have the identical reference, but nonetheless they can figure into these entirely different contexts. So the way Frege deals with it is that there are different senses. The name Superman has a different sense than the name Clark Kent. So Lois Lane, in terms of thinking about Superman, she's thinking about certain set of connotations, like he's a Kryptonian, he can fly, yada yada. Clark Kent, he's a mild-mannered reporter, etc., etc. And that's how you can get around this issue. And the issue I should clarify is that when Lois Lane is believing that Clark Kent is not vulnerable to kryptonite, she's mistaken and she's ignorant of the facts, but we wouldn't say that she's being irrational or she's making some fundamental logical error when she is believing that Clark Kent is not vulnerable to kryptonite. And the idea is that a Fregean can appeal to senses to how to make this distinction. Now the problem is for a million is that if they drop this appeal to senses, then the semantic content or the meaning of the name Superman and Clark Kent, again, on a million theory of names, is exhausted by its referent. But the referent of Superman and Clark Kent is the same individual. So given a million theory of names, one would take it that the meaning of the word Clark Kent and the meaning of the word Superman are one and the same. So if they are in fact one and the same, then from the fact that Lois Lane believes that Superman is vulnerable to kryptonite, it should follow, unless she's being irrational or making a basic logical error, that she should believe that that Clark Kent is vulnerable to kryptonite. But clearly that's not the case, right? So again, this is just sort of a very pithy take on a much more complicated issue with respect to Frege puzzles. And if you want to Google this later. This also figures into what are called intentional contexts with an S and opaque contexts, which is this idea that there can be contexts in which co-referring names, where one can substitute a co-referring name for a given proposition, and the proposition will change truth values. For example, Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly. Superman is Clark Kent. But the sentence, Lois Lane believes Clark Kent can fly, is false. So the puzzle is, how does the million make sense of how the name makes different semantic contributions to the sentence, even though given a million theory of names, Clark Kent and Superman should have the same meaning. So again, over and above this problem of negative existentials, there's this Frege, Frege puzzles, what are called Frege puzzles, which again were historically, they used definite descriptions and senses to solve, but given that a million, like Kripke, gives those up, it's hard to make sense of how they, or at least prima facie, it's hard to see how a million theory of names can accommodate it or can address it. And Kripke himself actually develops the second line of attack against his own view in his paper, A Puzzle About Belief, where he basically lays out, I mean, again, he ends up in a puzzle. Like, well, given a causal theory of reference, it seems like we would have to say that there's a, that Lois Lane is being irrational when she believes that Clark Kent cannot fly. But clearly that's mistaken, so he leaves up, he ends up in that paper basically in an inconclusive state where he sees a puzzle given that he thinks there are good arguments for the causal theory of reference, but at the same time it has these problems, so he's not sure how things play out. But those would be two among the other many, I don't know if I should say many, but various historical problems people have associated with a million theory of names like Kripke's, namely it can't accommodate negative existentials, at least prima facie, like sentences like Hamlet doesn't exist, because given that there's no reference to the name Hamlet, then there's no meaning associated with the name Hamlet. And secondly, they can't solve Frege puzzles. So that would be other territory if people listening to this hangout want to explore. We've talked about how Kripke's view has certain advantages or how it addresses certain deficiencies in descriptivism, and yet all the same, that doesn't mean descriptivists have remained idle. They have made, these are some of the various ways descriptivists have attacked the type of view of names that Kripke has.
Yeah, I think on the issue of negative existentials and some other problems with the causal theory of reference, I think Stroll's chapter on, I forget what the it's like the last chapter of the book, or in his book on analytic philosophy in the 20th century. I think that's one of the best sort of summaries of a lot of the problems with the causal theory of reference. But there's about the issue of Frege puzzles. I think the best piece on that is a piece by Akil Bilgrami. I think it's called "Are Meaning Intentions Degenerate?" And it's on, I think, his faculty webpage. You can download it for free. I think it might be called Crispin Wright Volume on that page. But I think that's the best summary of the problem that Frege puzzles pose for the causal theory of reference.
Yeah. I mean, we've just sort of contrasted here some, like, I guess the way the dialectics just developed so far is, like, in this hangout, we've developed, like, Kripke's, we've hinted at or explained some of Kripke's attacks on descriptivism and some of these conflations philosophers have made, like, between, say, the a priori and the necessary. And we've sort of pivotally laid out in brief some of Kripke's arguments against descriptivism, like the semantic, modal, and epistemic argument, his positive theory of reference that Alex explained. And so at the end of naming a necessity, the idea is that you come to a certain, very different picture from what came before, a certainly revolutionary picture. But nonetheless, that picture, people have taken it to have various problems. And this issue about negative existentials, both with respect to meaning and truth, and this problem with Frege puzzles, both with respect to this issue with how we can distinguish between ignorance versus irrationality in the case of someone like Lois Lane, as well as to the informativeness of sentences like Superman is a true uninformative statement, but Superman is Clark Kent is a true informative statement, but given that on a million theory of names, Clark Kent and Superman have the same meaning, they shouldn't differ in cognitive significance. Those are some of the issues people watching this hangout. If they're curious, they can explore some of the resources that Jack has mentioned, or they can just Google, like Frege puzzles or Million Theory of Names, Negative Existentials, or something to pursue further resources down that line.
That's great. Thanks for that, Hypatia, and thanks for that, Jack. So we should go ahead and wrap up the hangout. I actually maybe I'll hit you up, Jack, on ideas for hangout on beliefs. I think that's kind of a interesting thing that we could talk about.
Yeah, as Hypatia said, Kripke wrote a paper that basically, it all but refutes his own causal theory of reference, although ironically, he was basically in some way trying to vindicate it with that paper by showing, he lays out really as clearly as anybody has the problem with that Frege puzzles pose for the causal theory of reference. So, you might want to consider going over that paper at some point.
That sounds interesting. Cool. Thank you, everybody, for the latecomers, and thanks to Alex and Lolly and others who had joined us. So, I will probably in the next week or two figure out what the next topic along this line of hangouts will be. But thanks to everyone for stopping by and participating. I learned a lot. So, take care.